잊지 말아요 그 사실 하나만 우리 충분히 그리워했죠 지금 만나요 나가고 있어요
한 번 더 우리 또 기억해요 한 번 더 우리 노래 불러봐요 하나 되는 그날 가슴 벅차 오를 꿈을 위해 I want you 자 손을 잡아요 낯설지 않게 Remember this once more 그날의 그 아침 너는 눈부실 테죠 한 번 더 우리 또 기억해요 한 번 더 우리 노래 불러봐요 하나 되는 그날 가슴 벅차 오를 꿈을 위해 I want you 자 손을 잡아요 그대와 나 wonderful Korea wonderful Korea 내 곁에 지금 간절한 바람이 불어 저 멀리 그대를 스쳐온 그 바람 이렇게 가까이서 그대가 그리움만 나가고 있어요 그대도 내요 이것만은 들리지 않아요 우리는 결코 다른 적 없어요 조금씩 서로 한 걸음 더 다시 만날 거란 걸 That we want to be a family again
All right. Aloha kako. Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Korean Studies. Thank you for coming. We appreciate your time and presence here. I'm Harrison Kim. I'm a historian of Korea, Center for Korean Studies. Thank you for coming. We appreciate your time and presence here. I'm Harrison Kim. I'm a historian of Korea. As we start the conference, the Center for Korean Studies would like to honor the indigenous land and people of Hawaii. the Kanaka Maoli. We recognize and strive to learn more about the history and culture of the Kanaka Maoli. The Center for Korean Studies is grateful to have flourished on this borrowed land for the past 50 years. And we will continue to be responsible protectors of this beautiful and precious culture and land of the Kanaka Maoli. We need to make some acknowledgments. So today's conference could not have been possible without the funding support from the Asia Research Foundation and the Academy for Korean Studies Strategic Research Initiative program. And of course, our amazing staff deserve our appreciation. Courtney Oshiro Chin, Hain Lee, Yejun Guan, Singhyun Hong, and Hannah Granoff. Thank you deeply. So today's conference has the goal of envisioning peace on the Korean Peninsula from the practices of engagement, humanitarianism, and grassroots empowerment. This perspective requires formulating a critique of global militarism. It's the very militarism that sustains the hostility on the Korean Peninsula and perpetuates the insidious military industrial system in South Korea, in the United States, and in North Korea. So, peace on the Korean Peninsula is obviously a global issue. We have gathered good people to share their experience and expertise. So, would you stand and wave when I call your name, please? So, we have Tae-Young Baek, the director of this very center, professor of law. Tae-Young is a human rights scholar and once a radical activist. Look him up. Look him up. Look him up. Oh man. Oh yeah. 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 Um, Wikipedia solved that problem. Okay, and of course we have Ned Schultz, professor emeritus at the university. He's the vice president of Asia Research Foundation. Ned is a lifelong advocate for peace and unification. Um, we have Namson Song right here, professor at the Osaka University of Economics and Law, also the president of Asia Research Foundation. He himself is also a promoter and a champion of engagement with North Korea. We have Christine An, executive director of Women Cross DMZ and co-founder of Korea Peace Now. Christine is someone I call the most important Korean American in the Korea peace movement. Oh my, oh my. The film Crossings, which we'll screen later, is about Christine's extraordinary action in 2015. We have Manu Kayama from Hawaii Nuyakea School, Hawaiian School of Knowledge. It's part of our university here. Manu's work involves educating about and advocating for island sustainability and justice for Hawaiians. We have Betsy Yoon and Alexandra An from Nodutol. So very happy they're here. Nodutol is a grassroots organization that's been actively campaigning for peace and unification and engagement with North Korea and peace in East Asia for the past 20 years. We're so happy that you guys made it out here. Full disclosure, I was a member of Nodutol a long time ago. We have Key Park, who needs no introduction here. Yes, from Harvard Global Health Institute. Key is a neurosurgeon, and he's also the director of the North Korea program at the Korean American Medical Association. He works tirelessly to promote collaboration among physicians in the US and North Korea, a country that has been visited more than 18 times. We have Jenny Town from Washington, D.C., senior fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and the director of Stimson's 38 North program. The 38 North website provides some of the best analysis on North Korea out there, and it has simply the best mapping service you can find. It's something that I use myself. Go check it out. 38 North is it's an amazing website. We have Daniel Jasper from the American Friends Service Committee. In the headquarters in Philadelphia, but he's based in DC. Dan is a policy advisor and advocacy coordinator, which means he helps to pressure the Congress to toward dialogue with North Korea. He's also an active, he's been involved with humanitarian efforts with North Korea as well. We have Jae Song from the University of Melbourne, Korea Foundation Associate Professor of Korean Studies there. Jay has worked in the field of human rights for a long time, and she's a vocal champion of Korea's peace and unification. We have Ann Wright. We're so happy you made it. From Veterans for Peace. Ann is a retired Army colonel and worked in the State Department for decades. Ann is also a lifelong peace activist with a special focus on the Korean Peninsula in the past 10 years. Anne is also featured in the film Crossings. And of course, finally, Deann Borshay Liem. We're so happy that she made it. Writer, producer, director of Crossings. Deann's award-winning films, they belong among the canon of American independent films. And Deann and Christine are just returning from their screening tour in South Korea. So thank you guys for coming. With this, we will welcome our first opening remark by our director, Taeyong Baek.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii in Mānoa. My name is Taeyong Baek. I'm professor of law and also director of this center. I would like to first of all thank all of you, the speakers for today's event, who came all the way from Australia, Japan, New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, and other part of the world, only to share ideas and views on this important issue, building peace on Korean Peninsula, diplomacy, humanitarianism, grassroots primacy. I also would like to recognize our treasure, Professor Harrison Kim, who have worked so hard to make this event possible. Thank you, Harrison. Additionally, already Harrison mentioned about our staff, Center for Korean Studies staff, who had worked vigorously. In fact, to organize this type of conference, especially in the format of a hybrid, making Zoom available and also accommodating in-person participation is not easy. And all of the center staff worked very hard. And I would like to name their names again. So Courtney Oshiro-Chin, Hain Lee, Seung-yeon Hong, Ye-jun Kwon, Hana Grenov, Emma Taylor, and others. And I thank them. And please give a big applause for our staff. Already, Harrison mentioned this about Asia Research Foundation and Center for Korean Studies has a very strong cooperative relationship, and this event is greatly supported by that organization. And I also would like to mention that Academy of Korean Studies also supports this event as well. Today's international community and Korean Peninsula, in my opinion, are facing a very serious challenges. The escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war is really worrisome because it raises now even a concern that it could be a prelude to a nuclear war, which we had never thought before. North Korea is also confronting the world with a series of ballistic missile launches and even simulation of tactical nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the United States, Japan, and South Korea, for the first time, conducted joint combined military operation exercise just around the water of Dokdo, Takeshima in Korea. This all raises a big concern because this increasing militarism could lead South Korea to be drawn into unwanted military conflict. And the Korean Peninsula may see really dire situation, even if nobody wants. I'm extremely happy to offer this space for us to have an opportunity to, share our views, to exchange our views and dialogue, so that we can create a way to peace on Korean Peninsula. This is a very long conference with diverse elements included. I really hope we will find a way to better international relations on Korean Peninsula and also in the world. And I really hope we also can advise the United States government with some recommendation based upon our dialogue today. Thank you again for coming for today's conference.
So our next speaker, let's welcome Ned Schultz.
Aloha, aloha kako. And if I translate that into Korean, 여러분 안녕하십니까? 어디 영대 환대 하여튼 환영합니다. I'm going to try to give you a little history because we have a historian here, and he's a historian of modern Korea, and I'm stuck in the 12th century. But I think just a little bit about Korea and its history, particularly in terms of unification. And for those of you who know Korean history, around 600 there were three different major states or polities in South Korea, in what's currently the Korean Peninsula, Paekje, Goguryeo, and Shilla. And beginning roughly about 660, there were some major battles that erupted between these three different polities. And ultimately, Shilla was successful in pacifying both Paekje and Goguryeo. And they did this in part because they had outside intervention in terms of Tang China. Because Tang China basically allied with Shilla, and they were able to push out first Paekje and then ultimately Goguryeo. But the unification wasn't complete because essentially United Shilla really occupied the bottom two-thirds of the peninsula. And the northern part of the peninsula was a state called Parhe. And so essentially, throughout the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, you had a north-south relationship. Clearly, of course, because I've been educated in South Korea, I believe that the southern part was more legitimate than the northern part. But I just want you to realize it wasn't a total unification. In fact, some people question how unified Shilla actually had succeeded in bringing Paekje and Goguryeo into the Shilla world order. Then roughly at the end of the 9th century, a state called Hoop, later Paekje, emerged in the southwest. And then up towards the north, another state, which ultimately became known as later Goguryeo, also began to emerge. And so you're going back the beginning of the 10th century to a three-state division on the Korean Peninsula. And essentially, battles begin to erupt between these three different polities. And roughly about 935, there's a Shilla king, and his name is Gyeongsun Wang, King Gyeongsun. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but to me, as a historian, he is one of the greatest men to have been a king in Korea. Why? Because he was confronted in 935 with the stalemate. And suddenly he decides to put nation, people over self. And he basically abdicates his authority as the king of Shilla to the king of Goguryeo. And I hate to read you from a history, but I'm just going to give you a real brief taste of what the historical records say. And this is in the 10th month of 935. The Shilla king Kim Bu dispatched a man by the name of Kim Bong-hyung to request becoming part of Koryo. The king dispatched the acting chancellor and vice chancellor Han to deliver a reply. And then on the third day of the 11th month, the king of Shilla, at the head of all his officials, set out from the royal capital of Shilla. Both nobles and ordinary people followed them. The fragrant carriages and ornate horses stretched for more than 30 li. The roads were filled with throngs of onlookers who lined the roads like dikes. And so this is the procession. It takes 10 days to get up to the Koryo capital. And there's the official abdication and passing the power on to the Koryo king. And to me, this is one of the most magnanimous gestures. The man suddenly realized we could go on and fight, but if we go on and fight, what happens to our nation, the nation on the Korean Peninsula? And so with that, the unification essentially occurs. And Koryo goes on to rule for close to 500 years. The northern border is sometimes a little sketchy, and it's really not until the start of the Chosun Kingdom in 1392 that we see the borders finally solidified where it exists today. But again, for unification to occur, it's going to require great magnanimous gestures on all sides. Anyway, enough of my lecture. The Asian Research Foundation is a local foundation, and we're very pleased to support these kinds of things that explore Korean history, Korean culture. So have a great time today.
All right, we'll just go straight into our first session. So please, panelists, come on up.
Okay, we don't need to go through introductions again because we just did them. And we'll get right to the program. And it's a real honor to have Christine on here, who is what did you call her, the most famous Korean-American woman?
That's true too. That's true too.
Most
important.
Well, no. Activist, okay, because his wife is a Korean-American woman. I just wanted to know how he's going to skirt that. Anyway, Christine has been very, very active nationwide, internationally, and also here, luckily here in the islands. So with that, go for it.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I stand?
Of course.
Okay. Is it okay? I can, or I could just sit.
No, it's
Yeah,
easy.
really?
Yeah, it's easy to stand.
Well, because then I could take my mask off. And okay, good. Yay, we're ready. Oh, sorry, that was loud. Aloha mai kako, everyone. O manuka iama ko inoa, noho mai o ka ele pulu, o ko olau poko, o oahu nei. So mahalo nui. My name is Manu Ka'iyama, and it's just an honor to be here presenting in front of all of you. I work and teach and research at Scheidler College of Business, which seems quite opposite to my other part-time position at Hawaii Nui Akea Kamakakuokalani, the Center for Hawaiian Business. And many times there is great opposition that I feel between the two vahipana or places. I'd like to begin with the history of American military in our islands. So, yay, oh, went too fast. There we go. Let's see. Hawaii became a recognized independent nation state on November 28, 1843. This occurred at the Court of London, where the British and the French governments entered into a formal agreement or a treaty of recognition of Hawaiian independence. At this time, the American military would come into our harbors, pick up provisions when necessary, and leave. There was some trepidation with our government, and royal officials worked very hard because of the presence of different countries in our ports. They worked very hard to secure this recognition by the world of nations regarding our independence. On July 6, 1846, the U.S. Secretary of State, John C. Calhoun, on behalf of President Tyler from the United States, afforded formal recognition of Hawaiian independence as well. Around the same time, the Hawaiian Kingdom entered into treaties with all the other major nations of the world and established over 90 legations and consulates in multiple seaports and cities. When my husband and I had the good fortune of visiting Paris, we went and found one of these legations. It was fabulous. The Hawaiian king at that time was Kamehameha III. This is Kauikeauli in this picture here. And we really had a great nation. We're a very progressive nation where Hawaiian nationals, right, if you're born on the soil, you don't have to be Hawaiian blood. You're a Hawaiian national. No matter what their ethnicity or gender, could vote, hold key offices in government, and enjoy ownership of land, etc. The next slide shows an example of our progressiveness in the fact that our kingdom had a woman Supreme Court Justice, Miriam Kekauluohi, in 1843, versus America's Sandra Day O'Connor, first woman in American Supreme Court, appointed in 1981, 138 years after the Hawaiian Kingdom. So I'm just hoping that today I can share with you a little bit more about Hawaii than what you are inundated with by watching commercials where billions of dollars are spent on trying to attract you to our shores. We have a much richer history than commodification of my culture. So these were you can move on. Thank you. These were difficult years for the kingdom due to introduced diseases. Of course, we were isolated for many, many centuries. And once Captain Cook discovered us, we found that the introduced diseases decimated our population to less than 10% than it was in just one generation. Over a period of 50 years within that time, many foreigners moved to Hawaii and along with missionary descendants and took advantage of this, what they coined the time of dying. They began to convert fertile lands of sweet potato, banana, and taro that used to feed upwards of 1 million kanaka maoli. And they began to convert it to a drug called sugar. A group of mostly American businessmen who were in the islands establishing sugar plantations and becoming rich off of them realized at that time that the ruling queen was interested in restricting their business dealings, so they orchestrated an illegal occupation of the Kingdom of Hawaii through the use of the ignorant American military currently in the harbor. After being instructed by the American minister John Stevens, who was deeply involved in the scheme to take Hawaii, commanded of the military to land immediately in order to protect American interests. There was no harm being put upon American interests at that time. This was just the beginning of a prolonged, embarrassing relationship for the United States in Hawaii. Here at this time, the military, that was the last one. I went off script, so that's what happens. Thank you. Okay, so this is the American military occupying the Kingdom of Hawaii and assisting the illegal acts at this time of taking over government buildings, offices, throwing innocent Hawaiian leaders in jail to keep them separate from the community, and similar activities. Though the details of this horrific act against a friendly independent nation were too numerous to discuss here, know that once the Spanish-American War commenced, the United States opted to illegally annex the Hawaiian Islands by unilaterally enacting a congressional joint resolution on July 7, 1898, in order to utilize the Hawaiian Islands as a military base to fight the Spanish in Guam and the Philippines. So what I was just discussing was the fact that they went ahead and internally America decided to annex the Hawaiian Kingdom. If you know anything about international law and kingdoms or nation states, you can't just pass a law in your country that annexes some other country without their agreement and without a treaty. So you see a lot of local people wear this shirt, and this is what it means. Show me the treaty. There is no treaty. This taking of another country was not accomplished easily. Our people endured innumerable hardships. A deliberate program of inculcation was instituted, which included, among many other things, the banning of our own language at all costs. A nation of greater than 90% literacy before the occupation plummeted as adults as well as children were chastised, punished, and beaten for speaking Hawaiian. The United States has remained in the Hawaiian Islands, and the Hawaiian Kingdom has since been under prolonged occupation to the present, but its continuity as an independent state remains intact under international law. We are not a colony. We were not colonized. We are not the result of a coup, and we are definitely not a state of Hawaii in the Union of the United States of America. We are a country under prolonged occupation. Next. As you drive around Hawaii, notice all the American flags, a reminder to us who is in control, but also notice all the Hawaiian flags. Okay? These are not state flags. They are actually the Kingdom of Hawaii flags, which we fly in protest. Next. Right here, if you take a look, some innocent people, most people who live in Hawaii do not know our history. And here in Kailua, some innocent people had actually put up American flags all over to celebrate July 4th. Unbeknownst to them, there are a lot of Hawaiians that live in Kailua. Unbelievable, yeah, if you know this place. These Hawaiians went out, took all those flags down, and put up Hawaiian flags. That's the Hawaiian national flag. Next. And because the original people who were celebrating July 4th were upset, they put a sign in front of their happy 4th of July, and they wrote local. And then the Hawaiians came back and crossed that out and wrote settlers. So, this conflict is happening in little tiny villages all over all the time. Next. And here's a picture of an upside down Hawaiian flag. And this is flown over at UH Hilo campus, and they allow it to stay by itself. Next. Mahalo. Here, over 20,000 people took to the streets to protest a number of injustices endured by us Hawaiians. Included in this protest was the misuse of a beautiful land area called Pohakuloa on Hawaii Island. The military uses that land for bombing practice, which has systematically destroyed animal life, plant life, polluted the soil, and in turn the water sources beneath it. This land belongs to Hawaiians. It was stolen. They call it ceded. It was never, ever ceded. It was stolen and then put into a trust, which the trust caregivers charge the military $1 a year to destroy it. Next. This is, I'm going to talk about the U.S. Air Force Space Command runs several small telescopes on Haleakala, and a defense contractor has a part share in Newkirk on Mauna Kea. And this was a protest regarding the building up of Mauna Kea. Over 1,000 people showed up at the state capitol and protesting the continued misuse of all of our sacred mountains. Next. Even since the Spanish-American War, the U.S. military has been very purposeful about building up their presence here in Hawaii. As you can see, Fort Shafter Army Base, Schofield, Wheeler Army Airfield, 1,400 acres, 22 helipads, Kunia Field Station, Pohakuloa, which I was just discussing, training area for live fire training, and the fire always goes out of control. Branches of the military and allied nations profess to protect endangered plants and cultural resources. Right. Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam, closure law. And this is interesting. There's a base realignment and closure law in 2005. I'm sure some of you remember that. And what they did was they just combined bases. So nothing got closed. Next. Pacific Missile Range facility at Barking Sands. So every single island, has a presence. That's on Kauai. Marine Corps Base Hawaii, Station Maui Coast Guard Base, and United States Coast Guard Honolulu. Next. Oh, back one. So anticlimactic. You went to my bullseye when I wasn't ready. That's okay. I probably pressed the button up here. See, I take it. Okay, so here's military installations. Percent of land contained. Note that Hawaii has more land dedicated to military installations proportionately than any other state in the United States of America. Right, here we are. The darkest green. Okay. So what's the consequence of the military present in Hawaii? Well, we've become a bullseye. We are a target. Of course, we can go back to 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. USS Arizona Memorial is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Hawaii. No one goes, to see the palace. They don't know about that history. They go to Pearl Harbor. What they might not know is Pearl Harbor is listed as a Superfund site, right? Uncontrolled, abandoned waste site, one of the most populated places in the world. Careful if you're going to Pearl Harbor. You might get sick. Okay, sorry, but you can go there, but I'm going to keep talking, okay? On Saturday, I don't know, those of you who are local remember January 13, 2018, but suddenly all of our phones started going off. And we were just kind of driving on the road, my husband and I and my grandchildren, and he said, look at your phone, because when we came up to another car, we heard their phone going off. And I said, it's just flooding. We always would get alarms about flooding. Be careful on the roads. And I read, emergency alert, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. How many of you remember this? I don't know what you were doing at the time. I don't know if you had the luxury to know that it was a mistake, but I didn't. My family didn't. So when we saw that on our way to a soccer game, we quickly called each other in the family and decided to congregate at my daughter's home, which was close by, maybe a 10-minute drive. As we continued to do research, we realized we only had 38 minutes from the time that we got that message So we tried desperately to reach my 2 sons while explaining to my grandchildren not to be afraid. And I kept it together then. But now when I look back on it, I am so angry. I am not angry at the poor person who accidentally sent that message. No, I am angry that we are a target. It made it so real. One son finally called me with 5 minutes till the bomb and said, I can't make it to our sister's house. I love you, Mom. Goodbye. It was tough. So here's the current status of Hawaiians in Hawaii. Now remember, we were very prolific, we were very healthy before contact. We had great lives. Currently, we have the highest infant mortality rate. We score in the bottom quartile in standardized testing. High school graduation rate, only 48%, lowest in all ethnic groups. Unemployment rates 2 times higher than the next. 25% freshmen drop out in the second year. 40% felons incarcerated, double any other ethnicity. Average lifespan does not exceed the 60s. We're top on the Richter scale of substance abuse statistics, top of heart disease and diabetes, right? We tend to be diabetic because of all that lovely sugar. Next. Okay. So since the illegal occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom, if you realize that the intergenerational trauma that has of losing your country, and remember, this was not that long ago. My grandparents were born in the time of the kingdom. My parents were born in the time of the territory, and I was born in the time of the state. So when we get together, we have a lot of stories to share. We've learned a lot from our kupuna, or our elders. And recovery for us as a people has been extremely and painfully slow. An example of some of the atrocities that the military has done. Kaho'olawe, okay? Sorry, you went too fast. Okay, so I'll do a summary of this. They chose one of our islands as a target, bombed it, completely got rid of the entire level of, soil on top, broke the aquifer so that there's no fresh water there. And they returned it to us, promising that it would be restored. They ran out of money, and there's still unexploded ordinances embedded in the deep soil there. The next one is RIMPAC. And we did have a little bit discussion about RIMPAC. It's horrific to our islands. Okay, Hawaii has to host. This small little place has to host 26 nations, 25,000 personnel coming into our ports, 38 surface ships, 4 submarines, 170 plus aircraft. It's quoted as being the world's largest international maritime exercise, nations participating to strengthen their collective forces and promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. Seriously, they used to be honest and called it war games. Now, I don't know who their publicist is, but it really irritates me. You know, what about the harmful degradation of our oceans, of the sea life, marine mammals and dolphins, sonar effects causing countless whales to beach themselves and die? And they'll say, oh, we don't know what happened. Well, it's just cyclical, maybe climate change, etc. They litter the bottom of our oceans, can't even eat fish, because of, I'm very careful about what fish I eat because of the levels of mercury. And then next, Red Hill, which was eloquently already discussed. Our name is Kapukiki. Of course, they rename everything because they can't speak Hawaiian. So it's very sad. And we're just waiting to see what will happen with regards to this. Lots of promises and a lot of attention. You know why? Because the people whose water got tainted were on military bases and were, for the most part, service people. Think it would be getting all this attention if it was Nanakuli or Waianae? No. I promise you it would not. And also thanks to our sisters' hard work in making sure that it doesn't go silent. Next. And here you can see the most intense areas of pollution by the Navy because of Red Hill, the Red Hill disaster. Next. Oh, and here's unexploded ordinances. They are off every Hawaiian island, and they litter the entire Pacific Ocean. They're dumped there, by the military. I'm supposed to discuss the consequences of the military here in Hawaii. Next. This is Makua Valley. My ohana used to live here. At the time of the war, the military came in and said, we need to use this land because we need to practice live fire training, bombing, munitions, exercises. And my family said, of course, we want to help. We're American, right? Right? We have a duty. It's an honor. Okay, good. We'll give you back the land in the same quality that it is now. We believe you. Sign it. Okay? So it's supposed to be brought back to my ohana and others from Makua Valley at the end of World War II. Is World War II still going on? Must be, because we still haven't gotten Makua. Okay? So another promise not kept by the American military. A lot of Hawaiians find themselves, there are hundreds, if not thousands of stories. Uncle Kamaka gave up his land, okay? And he was a real staunch American. His whole family gave up their whole ahupua'a. And they promised to clean up his land. It didn't happen. Instead, the military came out and wrote checks and handed out checks to all of the people who owned the family, who owned the land. But Uncle Kamaka said, I don't want a check. I want my land back, like you promised. He never, ever took the check. And he never got his land back, and he's died. Next. So I put this in to show you that the war that we have with the American military is really sinister. This is an example of an appropriation and a continued disrespect for our culture and our beliefs. This is supposed to be funny, to show, the changing of command for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, wearing a hula skirt. Next. Oh, this is one of my favorites. If we read this, it says, should military families buy a house in Hawaii? If you own a home in Hawaii for 3 to 4 years, you could make over $100,000 when you sell it. We've helped hundreds of military families make over $100,000 on Hawaii real estate using their non-taxable BAH, which is an allowance that militaries receive to either rent or buy a home. The Honolulu BAH is about $3,000 to $4,500 per month. Per month. How many of you have that much to pay your mortgage or your rent per month here in Hawaii? I once sold a home for a military family who made $400,000 on their home in just 6 years. Because of the military housing allowance offered, housing prices here has skyrocketed. No one can compete with the military and their policy of their BAH. It's inflationary to our local housing market. It's harmful to our local people, especially the Aboriginal Hawaiians, who end up having to move away. Next. So you want me to critique the U.S. military in Hawaii? Not so good. These institutions hide behind the flag. They have absolutely no accountability to the residents of this place. They do not care about forever destroying water sources, land, our ancestors that deserve all the respect we can give them. They have no aloha for us. And this place we call home basically is shameful. We really are at war with America, and we are not winning. Next. So there really can be no peace without justice. Peace requires accountability, recognition of injustices, admission and discipline. It requires dedication to truth. It's hard work and sometimes requires action that cannot be denied and may actually be inconvenient. Peace is not docile and calm. It's a raging reality that takes, again, dedication and commitment. It needs vibrant protection. It's a value that has to be recognized and uplifted. It must come first and be considered paramount before all other decisions are made. Next. That's my bibliography. And next. Mahalo nui loa. Hope you have a beautiful day. Aloha.
Oh, thanks very much, Mon. You gave us a story that many people don't benefit from hearing, so this is a great introduction to Hawaii. And I wish what she said was false, but as a haole, it's not. It's an unfortunate history that's often hidden. Interesting that today they're having, theoretically, the final U.S. congressional hearings on the insurrection. So I guess we have some things to teach them in Washington as well, as you know. Anyway, we want to keep up on time. We're now very, very privileged to have Betsy Yun and Alexandria on. We have one more Miss An coming forward, and of course a Miss Yun, and it's welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. So we're going to talk, our title is Imperialism, the Korean Peninsula, and the Role of Koreans in the U.S. We're going to talk about we have 4 sections to our presentation. Oh, it keeps going back. I'm going to briefly introduce Norato. We're going to talk about our analysis of the problems. Then we're going to describe what work we're doing and then close out. Okay, so what is Norato? We call ourselves diasporic Koreans and comrades. We mobilize our membership to advance peace, decolonization, and self-determination in Korea and Turtle Island / North America. And we use political education, build collective action, and practice principled solidarity to achieve our mission. Am I pointing? Okay. Actually, Alex, can you do the clicking while I talk? I need to read the notes. Thank you. So Nododo was formed in '99 by Korean Americans who wanted a space that Koreans who couldn't speak Korean could participate in. And we have about 3 approximate eras that define our work from '99 until the present. So from '99 to 2007, our work was mainly divided between engagement with the Korean community. You can click the next one, which includes youth program, language classes, a free health clinic, and this activity occurred alongside anti-imperialist organizing, including against the Iraq War, Korea-US FTA, WTO, and our KEEP program, which I'll talk more about in a bit. Then the next era is 2007 to 2020. Which in response to continuous red baiting in the Korean immigrant community, we were unable to continue our community work and decided to focus more explicitly on our anti-imperialist and Korean solidarity organizing efforts, including the Korea Peace Treaty campaign, anti-US military base campaigns, Oral History Project, API People Solidarity Coalition, and the KEEP program again. And then 2020 to the present is characterized by both political realignment and opening up our membership to beyond the New York area. We didn't feel, so around the 2020, we didn't feel that we had an effective engagement with the George Floyd uprising and identified a need to have a stronger political alignment internally in order to lay out an effective strategy for material social change. So in order to do this, we launched a 6-month process of internal political realignment during which we paused our external work. When we finished this internal alignment process, we decided to open our membership up to folks beyond the New York area, due both to the pandemic and a high volume of interest from folks outside of New York. We have since then completed 2 rounds of onboarding new members and have more than tripled our membership. So Alex is now going to talk about our understanding of the main obstacle to peace in Korea.
That's okay, I'll click. Oh, keep the notes right there. Thank you, Betsy. This is fine, and I could click here. I could still click, right? Okay. Thank you, Betsy. Hi, everyone. Like Betsy shared, I'm Alex. Thank you to the Center for Korean Studies for having us again to speak and learn amongst people doing such amazing work. And thank you all for coming out today. So I'm going to speak a bit about our analysis on the core issues that we see regarding peace in Korea. So I start by sharing for us to say that it's not enough for us to say that we want peace in the abstract, right? Like Betsy, like Betsy had shared in the realignment process, it was really focused on getting material change and getting material wins, not being satisfied with what we were doing before and not achieving the things that we say that we want, right? So that begs the question, when we say peace, peace for who, peace from what, and who's really benefiting from the current situation that is in Korea. So for us in our analysis and understanding of history, the root of the issues in Korea stems from US imperialism. Peace on the Korean Peninsula will only be possible when US imperialism is ended. It's US imperialism that divided Korea, and it's US imperialism that's occupying Hawaii, as our presenter before so wonderfully described and broke down for us. Peace in Korea won't be sustainable within a vacuum. outside of a recognition and reckoning with the regional and international context in which Korea is situated in. Like Harrison mentioned in the opening, the issues in Korea is an international issue. So before getting into kind of describing our work, just a few examples to kind of illustrate our analysis on imperialism. So the current situation on the Korean Peninsula, how it really benefits the U.S. So first looking at the U.S. military power in Korea to encircle China. First example being Obama administration's Pivot to Asia initiative, and it's gonna come up, and the construction of that, right? Those two things being very explicitly to place U.S. strategically around China. And then next, the narrative around the threat of the DPRK to justify further spending and expansion as well. So the false missile alert that was just described by our former presenter, and the strong overtones, you know, of DPRK coming to attack us. And then the subsequent 4 years later, 2022 RIMPAC naval exercises, again with the strong overtones of the being targeted at the DPRK or preparing for the DPRK, and they in fact like sent out, you know, a strong denouncement. The DPRK sent out a strong denouncement of the RIMPAC naval exercises shortly after. And we bring these examples, you know, not to say that the false missile alert wasn't like there wasn't a real threat, because like as thank you to our presenter before this for testifying, like so strongly testifying, and really affected me emotionally. I couldn't imagine, you know, being in a situation like that. But again, in the narrative that's created around it, like the boogeyman is North Korea. Like we really have to focus on that instead of pointing to, well, why is Hawaii a target, right? Like why is there so much militarism in Hawaii? Like we have to point the finger at the right place, and that's U.S. imperialism, to then get to our methods and strategies and what we're going to do coming from that analysis. So while the U.S. is forever, you know, ramping up military strength, the DPRK is intensely scrutinized for any kind of defense efforts on their part. And again, the U.S. is the one has the insatiable appetite for expansion and never-ending, you know, control and domination of the globe. And that's really, again, where we want to focus our analysis on. And then turning to the economy, did I click it? So turning to look at the economy, oh yeah, sure, thank you. In Martin Hart Landsberg's research has asserted that over 40% of ROK's market is actually foreign owned. And Hyundai even, you know, in their internal reports have said that they're 46% foreign owned in 2018. And even on their website, they say like a big part of our strategy in sustaining themselves is being foreign owned. And so, so the South Korea is kind of positioned as a beacon of freedom and success in comparison to the DPRK. But when we look at, you know, economically the situation there, how free are they really? So again, turning our analysis to how this kind of the precarious situation in Korea really reflects, again, our focus on U.S. imperialism. So I'm going to share then, before we go into that. So therefore, we conclude that the U.S. doesn't necessarily want to keep Korea divided, but rather the U.S. wants to utilize the region as a tool to secure and maintain the dominance in the Asia-Pacific region, and ultimately as the top global power. So it's not division for division's sake. It's not militarism in Hawaii for militarism's sake. It's for securing U.S.'s position as the top global power. So for us to be for Korea peace is to be against imperialist domination by the U.S. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our work and how we're contributing to the peace and reunification movement. And I'm going to share a little bit about political education, and then Betsy will share about the Korea solidarity work. Okay, so for our political education, it is really emphasized within our organization, like Betsy had mentioned, in the realignment that happened recently. There was an emphasis on study and realigning in what our analysis is and kind of getting on the same page. So the purpose of political education for us is to develop a shared analysis of anti-imperialism to inform our vision and strategies for achieving reunification in Korea and a liberated world. And so we learned the history of Korea along with other struggles against imperialism across the world. Because again, we don't want to learn about Korea in a vacuum, but what is it in the international context? And in sharing about what we're doing to contribute to the Korea peace movement, we can't stress enough how important political education is. It's a foundation for doing the rest of our work thereafter. Our strategies and methods must have an informed base. So first I'll share about the internal political education work we're doing. So the first thing we'll share about that is it's focused on building shared definitions. So for example, if we're talking about being an anti-imperialist organization, what does that mean exactly? And it's also not just about being anti, but also what are we for? What are we projecting out into the world? What are we trying to create? And being very, very clear about that. Next, learning about historical events as well as keeping up with current events in Korea and internationally. A lot of people, join this organization feeling excited and wanting to learn about Korea, and a common thread is people feeling really overwhelmed by the history, not knowing where to start, not knowing what to read or believe. There's a lot of information out there, so so that's really emphasized as well. And then every member across our organization is required to study. So no matter how new or how long you've been involved in Korea Peace Movement world, everybody has to study. We have more to learn. And the culture of study, is very much is encouraged within our organization. And this has resulted really in building trust across our membership. Politicizing our Korean identities, studying and envisioning radical Korean struggles, it also cultivates this really rare space of trust and belonging amongst Koreans, diasporic Koreans specifically. It's like a really emotional process for a lot of us too, who don't know our family histories or bloodlines beyond a generation or two. But learning about the history and feeling connected in that way has created a lot of investment and a lot of trust amongst members. And the study and investment also has resulted in a lot of recent growth. So as people develop a deeper analysis of the issues, then it contributes also to higher commitment with more people. And then I'm going to quickly just go through things that we're putting out to the public. So one big thing that we utilize is social media. We have a really great group of folks who work on the social media. Shout out to them. So I'm just going to share a few of their posts real quickly. So an example is they do on this day, like type historical posts. So they keep track of, like events throughout Korean history and then use that as an opportunity to post on social media and then also connect it to modern day events and just things that are currently happening and providing our analysis. And then another type of social media post is, I don't want to click it too many times. Okay, there you go. Another kind is to then combat imperialist propaganda. So an example of a recent post we did was on North Korean defectors. And just kind of, like providing context and background information about like how some of them are like funded by the United States and the ROK government to come do speaking tours, and just providing like that additional background context. And so utilizing some current events to combat propaganda. And then some other public-facing political education things that we do. Some recent events. We had this really great webinar, Keep Stories from the DPRK webinar that folks were on. And so they told stories of when they had gone to Keep D. And again, combating propaganda that we might see about North Korea, and them telling from their own experience and what they saw. And then a cook-along event with the Lift campaign. It was on Chuseok, and that was a great event to then, disseminate information about the Lift campaign, and also like take some opportunity for some synchronized social media action. Some other examples of public-facing things that we do is we send people out on delegations. So recently, there was the International People's Brigade May Day convening in Cuba and Venezuela this past May that we sent some members. And then there was also the People's Summit in LA that was in response to the Summit of the Americas, the 9th annual, I think it was the 9th annual one that happened recently, and that was the response. So we sent a delegation for people to go, thousands of people went, and they got to build with people, I think, from over 15 countries. And then finally, there's members taking speaking opportunities, panels, podcasts, this conference such as this one, so that we can come and speak and build and learn amongst our peers working on this together. And then all these recordings for some of these public speaking opportunities are on our link tree if you wanted to check that out. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it back to Betsy to talk about some of our Korea solidarity work.
Okay, so our current Korea-specific solidarity work has about 3 prongs. So I'm going to go through them. The first is our Keep Our trip that we're planning for 2023. This photo is of a 2014 delegation to South Korea. Our second is working on the ban on travel to North Korea that was mentioned earlier. This picture is from our 2009 KEEP delegation. It's outside of the Shincheon Massacre Museum, which documents the massacres perpetrated by retreating U.S. forces during the Korean War. And our third prong is working with Korean atomic bomb survivors to hold a people's tribunal to hold the U.S. to account for dropping the atomic bomb. And this is from 2019 on the 100th anniversary of the March 1st movement in front of the Blue House, where A-bomb survivors and their supporters are calling for resolution to the issues of Korean atomic bomb survivors. So first, I'm going to give you all a little background on our KEEP program, which is most directly related to the first 2 prongs. So the Korea Education and Exposure Program predates Norutol, and the first trip was in '95, organized by folks in LA and New York, and Norutol emerged out of the New York group. Originally, the trip was annually just to South Korea, and then in 2001, we started visiting North Korea as well. Some of you who've been around for a while may know them as KEEP and DEEP. We now call them KEEP R for ROK and KEEP D for DPRK, since they are both Korea. And this picture is from our 2010 KEEP R delegation at an 8/15 Liberation Day celebration. And you can kind of see our KEEP flag right in the middle. It's kind of covered up. So the purpose of the KEEP R and KEEP D programs is to connect with our history and to locate ourselves as part of the Korean revolutionary tradition by actively engaging with liberatory struggles on the peninsula on both sides, developing relationships with our comrades in Korea, and strengthening our material understanding of how our role as Koreans in the US differs from Koreans in Korea, and how we will wage struggle in the US. And a singular question is, what, as Koreans living in the US, is our unique role and responsibility in Korea peace? So with that background, I'm going to describe our three prongs a little more in detail. So this year's KEEP program for 2023 is aimed at educating our membership about Korea issues in order to better equip ourselves for struggle here in the United States. This picture is from the 2010 KEEP R trip in Gangjong Village on Jeju Island, where the US and Korea have built a naval base. Our last trip to South Korea was in 2017. The KEEP program is normally open to all members of the Korean diaspora, but as I mentioned earlier, we have tripled our membership, and now a majority of us have not been on KEEP. So this is going to be an internal Noruto KEEP trip with the intention of not only strengthening our analysis and strategy, but also to build our capacity to hold these trips more regularly. From 1995 to 2008, these trips were held every year. Oh, actually, we held them every year from 95 to 2015. And from the period of 2001 to 2008, there were 2 trips per year. So I hope that we will resume our practice of regular trips, whether it is to the Korean Peninsula or to other sites of liberation struggle, both among Koreans and in solidarity with others actively resisting US imperialism. We must continue to learn transnationally and through praxis locate our struggle within international struggle. So the travel ban. If KEEP 2023 is aimed at our internal membership, we do our travel ban work with the Korean diaspora. As Alex mentioned, our Keep Stories from North Korea webinar was part of this effort. And as you see from the Kimchi Buns event, Kimchi Buns? Yeah, that's what it was. We are also part of the Lift Coalition. This picture is from our 2011 Keep D delegation. This is a steel factory that had just reopened after being closed for a long time. Here they make juche steel, which is steel that they can make self-sufficiently because of restrictions by sanctions. And I just want to point out that our dearly departed comrade Hyun Lee is over there. Sorry. Okay. The other presentations made me emotional, so now I'm just predisposed. Okay, our last trip to DPRK was in 2015, and in 2017, the Trump administration issued a ban on travel to North Korea. This ban is renewed annually by the State Department. Our aim is to build popular mass awareness of the harmful effects of the travel ban and of sanctions more broadly. But lifting the travel ban is not our ultimate goal. It's part of a larger strategy toward peace in Korea. How can we build a stable, just, and lasting peace when one side is so consistently portrayed as the enemy in our public discourse? It's absolutely essential that we combat this narrative. Let's not forget that the Iraq war was legitimated on defector testimony and satellite imagery, 2 things that are highly relevant to the Korean Peninsula. There is no path to peace through isolation, only through engagement. I remember my apprehension when I first went to North Korea in 2009. People were like, oh, I hope you get to come back, and things like that. And I also remember how transformative that experience was. It's one thing to know on an intellectual level that there are alternative ways of living and organizing society, and to know that Korea is one country, but it's a whole nother thing to actually experience it firsthand, to make deep connections with our people in the North, and feeling in your body and in the air that Korea is one. It's also one thing to know that the Shincheon massacre happened and how many were killed, and quite another to stand in a bunker in which retreating US soldiers burned Korean women and children alive. It's one thing to know that Korea is divided, and another to stand at the DMZ with your North Korean guides and translators and crying, as I am now, while singing Korea is one. This type of direct experience and people-to-people relationship building is essential to us building and strengthening the anti-imperialist movement in the United States. And our third prong, while our other two prongs are aimed at our internal membership and the Korean diaspora, for the People's Tribunal, we are strengthening our relations with allies in South Korea. We are working with SPARC, which stands for Solidarity for Peace and Reunification in Korea, and with the Association of Korean A-bomb Survivors to hold the U.S. to account for crimes against humanity when it dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. This is a picture of the A-bomb survivors and supporters in 2019 in front of the U.S. Embassy at Gwanghwamun at the time of President Trump's visit to South Korea, calling for the U.S. to take responsibility. The Korean survivors of the atomic bomb have been victimized threefold. First, the only reason they were in Japan in the first place is due to Japanese colonization, with a majority having been forcibly taken to Japan as conscripted laborers. Second, through the US atomic bombing, and then third, from neglect by the South Korean government. They are demanding accountability and reparations. And let's not forget that the military exercises between South Korea and the US include simulations of nuclear attack. The People's Tribunal is not simply about looking into the past, but is an intervention into something that is ongoing. A peaceful future cannot happen without accounting for these criminal and deeply anti-human acts. These are the three major projects that we are undertaking for the next year. We see these all as part of our effort to combat US imperialism and strengthen possibilities for legitimate, genuine, and human-centered peace in Korea. So, conclusion. This final image is at the entrance to the DMZ in Kaesong, North Korea. It says Chaju Tongil, which means independent or self-reliant reunification. I think it's an appropriate image to conclude this presentation on. So in all the efforts I outlined and Alex outlined, our efforts at spreading awareness do not simply mean sharing factual information. Korea's history is not just a matter of facts and dates. The facts need to be premised on an accurate analysis of the broad historical and geopolitical forces that gave rise to the current conditions, and people need to be organized to act on what they learn. The educational components of our three projects are deeply interwoven with our political analysis. Our experience at Noruto has demonstrated that we are more effective when we have a common analysis of imperialism and a positive vision for the future. We need to build power and change the narrative around Korea. And this means also understanding how Korea fits into the wider aims of US imperialism and how our struggle can't be waged in isolation from US encirclement and demonization of China, or from indigenous land and liberation struggles from here in Hawaii to Palestine, for example. The US encirclement of China itself is a violent process that is premised on, and cannot happen without the oppression of China's neighboring countries, including South Korea. The impetus behind these acts of imperialism are the same: to dispossess for the sake of accumulation and power. We cannot be effective without a comprehensive understanding of what we are facing. What kind of peace can we envision in Korea without challenging US imperialism, not only in the region, but worldwide? Can you envision a stable, just, and lasting peace under the shadow of US imperialist aims? The US has been the principal perpetrator of suffering, death, and destruction in Korea, and we as people living in the United States, I repeat, we as people living in the United States have a singular responsibility to not simply ask the US government to stop what it's doing in the Asia Pacific, but to build the mass power necessary to make it so that we are not asking. The US did not ask when it invaded, when it destroyed the Korean-led liberation movements in the South and forced the national division upon the peninsula, and neither should we ask. We must act now, and act collectively. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. You're making this a much more emotional morning than I expected. So we're running a little late. We're theoretically going to end at noon. So if some of you have appointments or other things you have to do, we understand. But I do want to reiterate, lunch will be served once we're done. So anything you want to just continue, right? Yeah, exactly. You know, all right. So, Mr. Park, Dr. Park.
First, let me just say, I always come here. I've been invited as a speaker, but I always learn so much from other speakers, and this morning has not been an exception. Thank you for all the hard work you're doing and inspiring me. I just want to say thank you to Teung and Harrison and Courtney for inviting me and really being amazing hosts. Jenny texted me during the last panel, said North Korea sent off another missile within the last few hours towards Japan. And my title is actually a question, right? Why we need a comprehensive and strategic approach to health cooperation with North Korea. So there was a missile that was fired within the last few hours. For the US right now, DPRK does not seem to be a priority, and ROK is now really taking on a very hawkish stance. And to North Korea's side, not only are they firing missiles and getting ready for possibly another nuclear test, they're rebuffing any kind of offers of assistance or diplomacy. So here we are with security issues really dominating the conversation, but can we look at non-security issues and can we actually try to dissociate that? And if that's the case, can we start with health? So I will tell you there are actually two examples where US and North Korea have agreed recently. One is the Singapore statement, right? And one of the bullet points is that there's going to be a new US DPRK relationship. So they both agreed on that. But the other one that's probably less known is a resolution at the World Health Assembly in 2015, Resolution 6815. It was a resolution calling for strengthening of surgical care as part of universal health coverage. And it was sponsored by a small country called Zambia. But it was also co-sponsored by United States. At this World Health Assembly, DPR Korea representative, who was actually on the executive board of WHO, also spoke in strong favor of this resolution. So in matters of health, sometimes US and North Korea see eye to eye. And then if you look at North Korea, for them, health is a top priority for their population. We've analyzed their spending on health as a percentage of their annual GDP. It's been sustained between 6 to 7% a year. And this is within the last 10, 15 years when the sanctions have been ramped up and they've been experiencing economic difficulties. They have maintained health spending. I have some personal observations. So I was in Pyongyang. My last time was in November of 2019. The Pyongyang Medical College Teaching Hospital, which is where I work primarily, I'm a surgeon, they have renovated all the ORs with sliding doors, new type of laminar flow rooms. They were showing me orthopedic spine implants to repair spine. I'm a spine specialist. It looked a lot like the ones that I brought to them. But they were so proud. They said, Pak Yibam Sonzeng, it's like that, Dr. Park, take a look at this. And they had really made their own spinal implants so that they don't have to rely on donations. I've worked in other countries, and I've not seen that other places. They also showed me a picture of a CT scanner that they developed in country, and it's using at one place, Kim Chek University. These are some examples of how North Korea has invested in health and want to be self-sufficient. Little known fact, Gavi, Global Vaccine Alliance, provides low-cost or free vaccines for countries in the developing world. North Korea has been paying, co-financing up to 20%, sometimes higher, for these vaccines. And they achieved 98, 90%, 97% vaccination rates across the country, at least for the kids. We also know that during COVID, when they reopened the cargo routes between China and North Korea, the first things they brought in were medicines, ventilators, and things to deal with the health of their population. So then you say, well, they are interested in health. They want to protect their population. Why are they refusing external offers of assistance? We know this. U.S. has offered assistance in COVID aid. ROK has. COVAX offers of vaccines famously rebuffed and saying, we're okay, give it to other countries. I think it really is a function not of their need. I think everybody agrees they need it. But it's really from the mistrust of the system and the donors that put money into this. And there are countless examples where health and humanitarian assistance has been weaponized by some of the donors, and multilateral organizations have also been guilty of succumbing to donor pressure. So let's talk about a comprehensive package of health assistance for North Korea. What would that potentially include? Well, first and foremost, we're in a pandemic. COVID assistance, right? Testing kits, testing machines, medical therapeutics, and those kinds of things. But more importantly, North Korea would like to strengthen their health systems, right? The hospitals, the workforce, the service delivery. These are equipment heavy, medications, those kinds of things. And then technology transfer. North Korea doesn't want to be a recipient of handouts. They don't like that. They rather be partners. They want to have a solidarity model rather than a humanitarian model. And they want to be able to develop their own vaccines and manufacture them. So that's a large, comprehensive package of health assistance. Who would be able to deliver that? And I'll play a little pun. Who is going to be able to deliver that? WHO. Okay. The reason is they have had previous nationwide large-scale health projects in the past, and it's probably the least politicized a multilateral organization, and they do value their membership within WHO. There was a regional meeting in Bhutan about a month ago. All the health ministers came. This is the first time since the pandemic, and North Koreans sent 2 representatives. It wasn't the health minister from Pyongyang, who goes. It was actually the DPRK ambassador to India. But he showed up, represented DPRK, and then signed on to a bunch of things. Right. So if we agree that maybe in the health space, we might consider a comprehensive package. What has been our approach in the past? Let's look at that. Look at history, right? So if you look at humanitarian assistance, health assistance, it's been fragmented, it's been uncoordinated, intermittent, and of course, as I mentioned, subjected to politicization. So can we talk about a comprehensive package that is delivered over several years without interruption, let's say 5-year package? I think this is of interest to the donors and also to North Korea. And there should be objectives. It should not be a tactical gift, saying, let's get to the table to talk about things. I think there should be among our long-term goals, number one, to improve lives of North Korean people. That should be the primary objective. But the second thing I think that can be achieved is the matter of building trust with North Korea. It's hard to build trust with North Korea right now on the security. But can we create a sandbox where North Korea and other actors play together, at least in the health sector, in a way that builds trust, right? Can we come up with an agreed framework, let's say, where North Korea does not shut down this project for 5 years, even if UN and US pass even harsher sanctions? And then would US and Japan and ROK and maybe UN Security Council, even if there's a nuclear test by North Korea, hands off on this delivery of health assistance, right? It's protected. And maybe if this is something they would agree on, that can build trust despite the security concerns. So for me, status quo is unacceptable. We're seeing more militarization, tensions are building, and then of course, innocent lives are being become more and more vulnerable. So I think there's a new way. We need a new way, and I think new way to build trust. And I think we can start with health. And I'm gonna just close with kind of a longing in my heart because of all the touching things I've heard today. So I long for a day, and I saw this building when I got here this morning. I almost in tears because here in the U.S. land, well, now I'm not sure it's U.S., it's Hawaiian land, okay? It's Hawaiian land. To see a beautiful Korean building and celebrating Korean people and culture. And I long for a day where we can do that. The beauty of our culture can be celebrated, but not just Korean culture, all cultures. I long for a day when world leaders are revered for their magnanimity, right? Not for their show of force, but magnanimity, magnanimous acts. And long for a world where people like that I'm sitting here with, the warriors for peace. This is warriors. This is not pacifist. Doesn't mean you sit around and sing kumbaya. These are people who are really putting themselves out there. And we're warriors for peace, like all of you, are honored. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very, very much. All 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. Yeah, you've given me a great morning. But now let's hear what our discussant has to say.
Yeah, thank you. We are kind of late on time, but it does not matter. We do want to take some questions, of course, from you guys. Anything you want to ask for our panelists. But if there's anything that I may add to the incredible dialogue is that what we are beginning to think about as we're sitting here is that we are trying to build a comprehensive approach to North Korea. As much as we can criticize militarism, it is not going to go away quickly. We have to learn how to work with it how to maneuver it. But at the same time, we will have to think of our role as civil society, how grassroots empowerment can become part of the same dialogue, how grassroots warriors can coexist with policymakers and also people at the Congress. Um, so this kind of comprehensive vision, it is an absolutely essential tool. I personally began to think about Korean peace as a member of Nodotor, emotionally charged, but historically trying to become aware as my place in this world. But at the same time, other people have enlightened me to areas of policy and also working with different sectors. And of course, someone like Key Park has opened our eyes to the health sector as well. So this kind of comprehensive vision merged with the transnational scope that someone like Manu has provided us today is an absolutely essential tool and philosophy for our movement. But please, any comments or questions from you guys, or any comments from the panelists? Yeah. Okay. Yes, Dan. Just a few questions. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you all. This was really educational for me. I just had a quick question for Key. I'm curious, where do you see the specifics of a package like that? Is it COVID based? Is it more comprehensive? I mean, is it vaccines? Could you spell it out a little bit more? Sorry if I missed it in your presentation.
Sure. So this COVID package, testing kits, testing machines, I think North Korea has maybe 20 PCR machines in the whole country. That's why they couldn't track the outbreak. Health system strengthening, which is a very nationwide type of project. And I failed to mention the humanitarian aid component should be part of that. So each year, the UN publishes this urgent needs and priorities of North Korea. And that includes food, basic meds, clean water, those kinds of things. And that typically they ask for about 120 million per year. And I think you probably know that it's it depends on donors, and they typically get around 25 million. And if you know how the UN system works, there's a huge overhead. So you really question how much benefit that the North Korean people are getting. What if we fully fund that for 5 years straight? So 125 million for 5 years, about $600 million as part of the overall package. The program continues no matter what. And so that there's that continuous supply of assistance. But that's embedded within the overall health cooperation package. And then vaccine technology transfer. So WHO has the vaccine hub. The South Africa is now the place where they're teaching how to do mRNA vaccines. And actually, South Korea is where they're teaching how to manufacture vaccines. And I think we're looking for ways for North Korea to be able to participate in that hub. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Key. Anybody else?
I have a question for Key also. I heard recently that North Korea, I don't need this, North Korea opened the border. Oh, I need to use the mic. Okay, that North Korea opened the border, obviously, for trains to come through China, but that the border towns have been vaccinated. Do you know more about this information?
I have no information on who's being vaccinated.
Okay, Manu, what is the meaning of upside down Hawaiian flag?
Countries in distress.
I see. So it is it also a statement of anti-U.S. government?
The fact that they don't put an American flag when you see, the proper, I believe, procedure when you fly a flag, you're supposed to have the American flag on top and then the state. And We fly our flags without any American flags attached.
That's right. That's right. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, guys, for this amazing morning session.
Is from the organization called American Friends Service Committee, and he is an expert on U.S. North Korea humanitarian cooperation and peace building, and he is a public education and advocacy coordinator for Asia of the organization. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to meet with him in person today. Our third speaker is Professor Jae Song, who is from the University of Melbourne. The other day I saw her face from CNN, and I think she had appeared on CNN multiple times, and she is increasingly demanded these days. And along with that kind of activities outside of the academia, she has also gotten tenured associate professorship. The title actually is Korea Foundation Associate Professor in Korean Studies at Gender, Environment, and Migration at the Asia Institute of the University of Melbourne. And she is also currently serving as a deputy editor for Asian Studies Review. I have known her since she was a master degree student, so I'm so glad that she is doing tremendously important job these days. Finally, we have a very, very excellent and distinguished discussion today, Dr. Nam-sun Song, who is a professor of linguistics in the Faculty of International Studies at the Osaka University of Economics and Law. And he is also president of Asia Research Foundation, and he has been leading the International Society for Korean Studies and many important activities in the area of Korean peace and also the enhancement of relationship between the two Koreas. This morning we had seen an area, where many of people who are devoting their energy to promote peace in many fronts. And this afternoon we are going to talk a little bit more on the policy and analysis of current international relations, and also finding a way to move ahead. What is going on at this time, and what can we do to promote peace on Korean Peninsula? So I'm really thrilled to invite all of these presenters. So I will not interrupt when they are presenting. They will present one after another, and after that, I will come back to moderate the question and answer, and also, if possible, some dialogue among our speakers as well as the audience. Please give a big applause to today's speakers. Thank you. Jenny, you go first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Beck, and thank you to Harrison for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Hawaii, and that's exciting as well. So the title of my talk today is, Can Old Dogs Learn New Tricks? Washington's intransigence on North Korea. And I figured since my title is already a little controversial, I might as well just go all in. So this is not a popular view. We won't name names here, but it is sort of my critique of kind of where we've been and how we've gotten to where we are now. So I want to start by saying, when we talk about diplomacy with North Korea, there tends to be this narrative that U.S. has been negotiating with North Korea for almost 3 decades and all of it has failed. Well, like anything, that narrative is missing a little nuance. And one point here is that, no, we haven't been in constant negotiations with the North Koreans for 30 years. We've had episodes of negotiations of which we're always looking for quick results. We want things to be wrapped up easily, quickly, and we want the North Koreans to concede easily and quickly and move forward. Some of these episodes have been more successful than others, but with each failed agreement, the mistrust builds and the political will to keep negotiating diminishes on both sides. So now when we enter negotiations, we assume failure as we go into it. We're less willing to try diplomacy in general for fear for being labeled, naive or getting duped by the North Koreans. And it's often a very one-sided history that gets told. And I like to think of it as like a Rubik's Cube. So, there is a way to solve it. Not everyone can do it. And you try really hard the first time you pick up the Rubik's Cube. You're twisting and turning. You might get one side or two sides or three sides, and then you still have problems on the other sides. It's a very complex issue. It takes a lot of moving pieces to get it right. But it's also like a Rubik's Cube in the fact that the first time you try it, you try really hard. The next time you have less tolerance for it, less will to keep trying. And every time you try after that, again, it's less and less time you're willing to put into it. And I feel like that's how we approach North Korea. Every time we go in, we're already frustrated and we just don't have the political will to keep trying hard each time. I think it's also worth noting that the second big point here is that there really was a precedent set when the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the agreed framework in 2002. And so this was after the change of administration from Clinton to Bush. And yes, there were problems with implementations on both sides of the equation, but the broader relations were in a good place and were moving in the right direction. And the terms of the actual agreed framework could have been renegotiated to deal with those changing realities and with those challenges with implementation. But instead of doing that, the unilateral withdrawal from the agreement, it both damaged our credibility, the US credibility as a reliable negotiating partner. It builds new levels of mutual mistrust. And it really set a precedent for whenever things get tough in the implementation process, and there will always be challenges when implementing any kind of agreement, that instead of putting in the time to work through them, that any side can simply walk away. So, and this is something that we've seen happen early in the implementation phases of now several agreements with North Korea, between the US and North Korea. It's also worth noting that during this 30 years, North Korea has not remained static, frozen in time, waiting for a deal to figure out its next moves. So in this meantime, North Korea has moved forward with its nuclear development. And I know, earlier today we talked a lot about kind of US militarism and the idea that we have this threat narrative about North Korea, which is true. And there is some rationale for this, some reason for this. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the reality is that, yeah, North Korea has moved forward with its nuclear development, but our approach to North Korea has not fundamentally changed. We still approach negotiations the same way we did during the agreed framework negotiations, when North Korea had only the capability of producing fissile material, but had not yet demonstrated weapons technologies. But that's not who North Korea is today. So on the nuclear side, since then, North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests so far, demonstrating both tactical and strategic weapons capabilities, has produced enough fissile material for somewhere around 40 to 60 warheads. And given that their new WMD goals that they set last year, we expect to see more nuclear tests in the future. When, nobody knows, but they like to speculate. So we also have seen North Korea's demonstrated a full range of missile capabilities, from cruise and long-range cruise missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles for in-theater intermediate range ballistic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach US assets in the region and on the continental United States, which obviously complicates defense and extended deterrence planning. North Korea has also made advancements in submarine launch ballistic missile technology, and while they only have one ballistic missile submarine so far, they have been working on another one that's supposed to be larger to be able to accommodate larger and more SLBMs in the future. And obviously building a fleet that would make this a game-changing technology is something way down the line in the future. But they've also indicated now the potential use of underwater missile silos or missile launch capabilities from fixed positions, not just subs. So it's evolving capability. They've restored the Punggye-ri nuclear test site to operational status after unilaterally sealing the test tunnels back in 2018 to create the environment for negotiations. They've built what is believed to be a uranium enrichment program both inside and outside of their Yongbyon nuclear research center, and restarted their plutonium production reactor, the 5-megawatt reactor. And they're working on upgrades to their main space launch facility with stated goals of being able to launch bigger military and reconnaissance satellites in the future. So there is progress that's being made. There is reason why the anxieties continue to grow, especially in South Korea, about these growing capabilities. And a lot of these developments do, like I said, pose challenges to the alliance and alliance defenses because they do have now the ability, North Korea does now have the capability to reach both in theater and the US. There's also a lot of unknowns here as to how many of the missiles they've tested are actually deployed and in what numbers, the accuracy and reliability of them, the actual number and size of warheads that have been produced, or what exactly North Korea even means when it talks about tactical nuclear weapons and how it differs from the original goals of mating warheads to their old Scuds and Nodongs. These are all theater-based capabilities. But the takeaway is that North Korea doesn't just have nuclear ambitions, it has a nuclear program. And its capabilities grow. As its capabilities grow, so does its strategy and its willingness to negotiate about that nuclear program. And yet, we still approach the issue in the same way we did when it just had the 5-megawatt reactor and insist on a denuclearization-centered transactional approach to North Korea that is fully contingent on Pyongyang making the right decision first before any kind of transaction can happen on any part of the relationship. And well, that means we've created a negotiation process that gives North Korea all the agency in deciding the terms and pacing of negotiations. When they're not willing to negotiate, as is the case right now, if they're not willing to negotiate on their nuclear weapons, as is the case right now, then we wait. We don't wait idly by. We fall back on bolstering deterrence and trying to dissuade North Korea through the use of punitive measures such as sanctions, and expect that if we just put enough pressure on North Korea, they'll see they have no other choice than to give up its nuclear ambitions. Well, it's been 30 years of trying that, and it's really time to start acknowledging the realities of the moment and think about a new approach. While trying to achieve North Korea's nuclear disarmament can still be a long-term goal, it's obviously not going to be a quick process or an easy decision to convince Pyongyang to make, especially when the broader security environment in Northeast Asia is becoming more dangerous and an arms race is accelerating in the region. It isn't just North Korea that's developing and testing missiles, even though that's what we see most prominently in the media. It's everyone, including the US, including South Korea and Japan. It's a much harder case now to make to the North Koreans to stop their development while all their neighbors are actively arming up. So until those trends start to move in a more positive direction, I wouldn't expect much interest from the North Koreans in anything we have to say on this issue. But there's a bigger problem here now. And those, there's a whole school of thought now who advocate a more arms control approach to North Korea. So instead of putting denuclearization, a centered approach where everything is contingent on North Korea's willingness to denuclearize, Arms control is sort of one step down, this idea that we can talk about mutual capabilities. But that is the problem now, is that if you're talking about arms control, the implication is that it's mutual arms control, not unilateral, not just North Korea limiting their programs. And so arms control has worked in the past best, obviously, when there is nuclear and military parity, when all parties can agree to mutual reductions that keep the balance of power while improving the security environment. But with North Korea, that's not the case. Even with its advancements, North Korea still has the inferior military and nuclear capabilities compared to South Korea, and especially to US-South Korea combined forces. And so that means what we are asking of North Korea is to remain in an inferior military and nuclear capability and to trust us with their lives and existence. What we need to start thinking about in terms of a new approach is what would it take to convince North Korea that this is an attractive option, especially while emphasizing also the values clash in political systems as we go forward. So while we might tell North Korea we have no hostile intent, at the same time we are advocating a world order in which we have pitted democracies against authoritarian states. So certainly bolstering deterrence is a part of alliance management, is necessary, to help reassure South Korea of our mutual defense commitment. But it's not going to intimidate North Korea into changing its strategic calculus. And instead, it only works to, the North Koreans use this to justify their continued development. So, the bottom line here is we need a new approach, one that creates a pathway for relations to improve, for trust to be built, and creates options for the North Koreans to choose that aren't contingent on their moves first. And that's a real tough pill to swallow in Washington, as it's both an admission that what we've been doing, that we got it wrong. And because we've stuck to the same approach for 30 years, now for us to change tactics, to be proactive, to provide different options to the North Koreans, it now looks like we're rewarding North Korea for their bad behavior. But we need to ask ourselves, what is in US interest? Further militarization in Northeast Asia, and possibly further nuclearization in Northeast Asia as South Korea and Japan weigh their options, or taking a few lumps to change course. And so I don't have all the answers of what a new approach might be, but certainly this morning, in the discussion with Key, there's many areas in which there is potential for cooperation that can build the relationship in a different way, that if we can get away from this denuclearization-centered approach and start talking about the relationship as a whole and how do we improve the relationship in order to get back to the security issue, these are the kinds of things we need to start thinking about going forward. And I'll leave it there.
But in the meantime, I just want to thank the Center of Korean Studies for putting this together and everybody who's been a part of this. It's been immensely educational for myself, and I really appreciate bringing together this discussion. It's incredibly important issues we're talking about here today. I also want to thank you for the very generous introduction. Last night, Harrison asked me if I was, he said, you're well known, but you're not Christine Ahn famous, right? And I thought, nobody is Christine Ahn famous except for Christine Ahn, right? So it's a great pleasure to be here. And, I'll just quickly say, too, as we get set up, thank you. I'm here representing the American Friends Service Committee. However, I should note that I have recently accepted a new position with a group called Project Drawdown. And I mentioned that for two reasons. One, I can be a little bit more candid here today, especially about my time in Washington. And two, because I'll be bringing in material from my new position that focuses on climate change and poverty alleviation, specifically in Southeast or South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. But a lot of it is very applicable to North Korea, I think. It's worth noting that a lot of these earlier presentations set me up for a lot of these conversations. And I'll probably be able to truncate some of my remarks, given that some of it's been covered already. But basically, the primary thrust of my presentation here is an open question. Will the U.S. be forced to take a different approach? I think we've heard a lot of discussion about what that could look like and why that's necessary, but we haven't really discussed some of these other existential crises that we're facing currently. So I'm going to try to cover 3 existential crises in 20 minutes, so this should be a fun presentation. And they're basically, there's a lot more that you can include in this presentation, but these are the ones that I'm most familiar with. Just quick background on the American Friends Service Committee. It's a Quaker organization that was actually founded in World War I. It was a way for Quakers, who are pacifists, to serve their community without using violence. So it was an alternative form of service. And as Key Park said earlier today, being a pacifist doesn't mean being complacent, right? It means that you have to be active, and Quakers have really embodied that. So, is it on? Oh, okay. Okay, so just a quick outline here. I'm going to quickly talk about our history in Korea. And then I'll talk about COVID, the challenges and opportunities around sanctions, climate change, and then I'll conclude if this PowerPoint goes forward ever. Okay, and the conclusion will focus in on what's the future of U.S. grand strategy going to look like. Just quickly, background on the American Friends Service Committee in Korea. AFSC has been involved in Korea since essentially the end of the Korean War. It was one of the first U.S. NGOs to respond to the UN call for reconstruction efforts in the South. And you can see this picture here in the upper right, which is reconstruction efforts. They stayed involved, I think, in South Korea for about 5 years, fulfilling their UN contract, but stayed engaged in the region in the following years. And a primary concern with regard to regional security was the ongoing Korean War. And for many years, our staff tried to enter the DPRK, and in 1980, they were successful. And they became the first U.S. NGO to enter the DPRK in 1980. Did I do that? This is why you don't do PowerPoints, right? Okay, going back. Okay, and so in 1980, they became the first U.S. NGO to enter the country, and that kicked off a really important relationship, and we built a lot of trust. And for many years, we were doing exchange programs, bringing North Koreans to the United States and vice versa. And you can see this really wonderful picture here of AFSC staff and North Koreans standing in front of the Liberty Bell. And that's not a picture that you see very often, right? But actually, that was pretty commonplace throughout the 80s and 90s. That relationship became really crucial in the mid-90s when North Korea experienced the famine. Actually, AFSC staff were some of the first internationals that were shown the reality of the situation. And I've read the reports, and the North Koreans basically said, we need you to see this, and we need you to put out credible information for the international community. So AFSC became one of the first organizations to call for aid during the famine. When that happened, our staff recognized that food security was an important element of this conflict, and it was something that we could address directly. And so from there, we started a conservation agricultural program that still exists today. We've paused for COVID, but we do expect to restart. And you can see this picture here where our staff are walking with North Koreans in a greenhouse. So some of this I'll bring in later in some of these experiences, but for now, it's just important to note that we work on conservation agriculture, but we're connecting the dots between human security and the larger picture of the unended war. So going to the first existential issue, COVID, I think it's clear that the global response was a failure, right? I mean, there were 6.5 million deaths, over 1 million in the US alone. For context, I think that's about 2.5 million more than the Korean War itself. So it was a total failure. And others in this audience can speak to the reasons why better than I can, but I just want to point out a few. From my perspective, the years leading up to the global pandemic, there was a deliberate, I think, destruction and obfuscation of humanitarian aid and global health cooperation, both with US North Korea as well as US and China. We saw that with our work in largely like 2 regulatory buckets. We saw it with sanctions, where they began to make it more difficult to send shipments of aid to North Korea. And we also saw it with the travel ban, which we heard about earlier this morning. The travel restrictions basically made it very difficult for us to travel there. And I will note that there was a period where basically nobody was receiving permission to travel to the DPRK. It wasn't until the Trump administration was put on the record and basically embarrassed for not allowing humanitarian aid workers to travel there that they reversed that situation. He talked a little bit about the weaponization of aid, and this was really that era, and I think it started around 2017. We also saw things like the Global Fund, which funds really critical work around tuberculosis in North Korea, was shut down basically as a result of the Trump's maximum pressure campaign. There was also other critical components, especially in the U.S.-China relationship. There was really important cooperation happening around the U.S.-China CDC. They set up a joint CDC operation in Africa, and there was a lot of success. All of that was gutted in the years leading up to the global pandemic. And so we were essentially put on the worst possible footing right before a global pandemic. So, and I think it's also important to note that the world didn't really come together as in other disaster moments. The other one that comes to my mind is 9/11. It's important to note that even after 9/11, North Korea showed support to the United States. And then Senator Joe Biden actually made a point to basically rebuff any North Korean efforts to help track down terrorists. We didn't see that at all when COVID came out, right? And I think that it was also an opportunity for various stakeholders, I guess, to push various agendas. We saw it with the Trump administration. We know that they actually made calculations that COVID would rip through urban areas and thus take out Democratic voters. And so there was this element of let it happen within the Trump administration, pushing their political agenda. We also saw it with corporate and other agendas as well. It's also worth pointing out that scientists fear that COVID is a dress rehearsal for a more deadly pandemic in the years ahead. And this is really scary, and I don't mean to be a bummer, and some of this presentation is going to be a little bit of a bummer, and I apologize for that. I hope to end on a good note, though. But I think it's important to note, because we failed this dress rehearsal terribly. But it does present somewhat of an opportunity. I think, as we heard earlier today, it has become an acceptable form of engagement with North Korea. For some reason, the administration, as well as primary actors in Congress, seem to think that COVID is okay, is an okay form of engagement with North Korea. The administration and Congress have promised to expedite aid when and if North Korea accepts that aid for COVID. However, they refuse to fix systemic issues that complicate the delivery of aid. Again, we're talking about sanctions, and we're talking about the travel ban. I think that that's really problematic, because while you can expedite maybe a couple shipments, if you're not fixing the overall system in which aid happens, I think it's really disingenuous and actually is quite counterproductive. And I'll talk in a minute about why that is. So, I think it's totally indefensible to sort of pick and choose which health crises to engage on. While the administration says, COVID is okay to engage on, we're still not okay with engaging on certain things like clean water. For context, in the North Korea context, the State Department considers clean water initiatives to be part of development assistance, not humanitarian aid. So there are certain elements that are considered humanitarian aid and development assistance. Development assistance is not allowed, period. There are certain exceptions for humanitarian aid. So when we're talking about treating COVID, I just recovered from it actually 2 days before coming here. And I can tell you the number one thing that was important to my recovery was clean water. I've also been in the Peace Corps. I know what it's like to live without clean water and how hard it is to recover from any sickness, including just a simple cold, without clean water. So how can we effectively address COVID when we don't even consider clean water to be part of that treatment? I think there's some serious issues there. And I think that there's a lot of political room to push back on this and to push for more substantial and a more holistic approach. So, and as Key made this point really brilliantly earlier today, that health cooperation is human security, which undergirds geopolitical security. And I'll have more on this in a bit. Okay, turning to the other existential challenge here, sanctions. I argue that sanctions are an existential challenge. And I think that more and more people are starting to agree with this. You can see here, we know that sanctions are hurting aid efforts, and we know that they're hurting ordinary people in North Korea. And you can see here that more important people, like I said, you see this op-ed from Anthony Rowley, who makes the argument that sanctions on Russia is basically putting the global economy at risk because it's compounding various disasters, including supply chain crises, inflation and debt. and it basically puts the entire world economy and global supply chains at risk. So, according to the US Treasury Department, US sanctions have increased 933% in the last 2 decades. There are over 9,400 sanctions designations. Here's the kicker. There is zero accountability on any one of those designations. There are no formal assessments on the impact of these huge, huge weapons, right? They only conduct informal assessments. And this was released in 2019 from a GAO, a Government Accountability Office, did a study about what does the administration do to look at the impacts of sanctions. And basically they came back and said, well, they kind of eyeball it. And the administration admitted that there was several problems with doing impact assessments. The goals constantly shifted. There was no policy that mandated this. And that's one that we really struck on as civil society, the fact that there is no policy mandating impact assessments. For the last 3 years, we have worked to include provisions within the National Defense Authorization Act, which would mandate impact assessments. Every single year, that provision was stripped out at the last minute. It passed the House, but it would never get through the Senate. And you have to ask yourself why. I mean, they're almost compulsively putting on these measures, and yet they refuse to look at what the impacts are. And I think that there's probably insecurity amongst politicians who have been championing these policies for decades. I don't think they want to reveal what the real impacts are, to be quite frank. I also think that there's a degree of fear, right? Nobody wants to look like they're being sympathetic to U.S. enemies, and I think that really does enter the conversation here. I also think sanctions are meant to induce fear on stakeholders and banks. We talk a lot about the impact on sanctioned communities, and the focus should be on there. There's also the secondary impacts on stakeholders, humanitarian aid workers, and banks as well. One example of this, the AFSC works, I think, probably like 18 countries. We work all around the world doing various different programs. We have a program in Indonesia. We also have a program in Kenya. And both of these programs had longstanding relationships with local banks. And overnight, these banks just, one time, they just basically closed our accounts, and they didn't tell us why. And we asked them why, and they said, we're not obligated to tell you. And so just like that, overnight, our relationship was destroyed. And we were 100% positive that the reason for this was because of our engagement in the DPRK, as well as other sanctioned locations like Zimbabwe. And so you can see, I mean, these banks had nothing to do with those programs. But just the fact that we work there was enough to scare them away from working with us. That makes it incredibly difficult as aid workers to actually do this work. There's a really terrible example of, we worked with a Quaker donor who I think was from North Dakota, and he had what he figured was a drought-resistant bean that would work really well in North Korea and help basically shore up protein deficiencies. This was under the Obama administration. He wanted to donate about 16 boxes of beans that were maybe about yay big, right? Not much. It took us 1.5 years to get permission to send those, and this was under good times. Here's the kicker, though. The approval process is an interagency process, and I think it includes about 16 different agencies. That's the State Department, the Treasury Department, the White House, the CIA, Commerce, and a number of other intelligence agencies. I find it very difficult to understand why the White House was weighing in on a shipment of 16 boxes of beans to North Korea, and yet that's how they were using their time. Unfortunately, the donor we were working with, in the period where he donated the boxes, he was unfortunately diagnosed with brain cancer, and he passed away before we were actually able to make the shipment. And to me, I mean, it was just so heartbreaking, right? And I had recently spoken to his wife, and his wife said, I still remember him yelling, we're sending beans, not bombs, for God's sakes. And again, I think it's meant to be the case. It's meant to scare donors. The sheer scrutiny that they put on you is meant to scare you away from ever working with them. The last example I'll give here is there was a Treasury investigation on AFSC for our work in North Korea, which was quite astounding. And I won't go into this too much in detail. There was an NK News article that I really encourage you all to read. But suffice it to say that traditionally, if an NGO like AFSC have been working in a context for over 40 years and the Treasury Department is aware of their work, we would actually brief the State Department and Treasury Department before going on trips and afterwards. And not only were we telling them exactly what we were doing, we were telling them that they should be doing the same thing and that the US should be scaling up these types of programs. So there was nothing but transparency. And typically in those situations, the Treasury Department, if they believe you're out of compliance, will write you a letter and they will say, we think you're out of compliance here, here, and here. Please tell us how you're going to shore that up. Instead, the Treasury Department under Trump went straight to a subpoena and basically held over our heads very serious consequences, including jail time. We had to turn over tens of thousands, I think over 50,000 emails. And this was, I think, to be quite honest, I mean, you know, when you read the article from NK News, they point out the fact that the way the regulations were written was basically everybody was out of compliance. And there's a long story there that I'll spare you, but the fact is that they zeroed in on the American Friends Service Committee. There are maybe less than 10 US NGOs that do this type of work, and only one of them has a very vocal advocacy program, the American Friends Service Committee. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why they picked us to do an investigation on. And we've heard earlier today that evidence suggests that sanctions only worsen humanitarian, human rights, and geopolitical situations. So, and when you talk to North Koreans about this too, I mean, I think it's really clear that sanctions increase resentment towards the United States, and they likely entrench the leadership there. So, I mean, it's backfiring in just about every single way you could imagine. I think sanctions sometimes seem politically untouchable because it's just very difficult to have reasonable conversations around this in the United States, specifically in Washington. However, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's important to note that we were on the verge of introducing major legal reform efforts in Congress. And I cannot stress how big of a deal this was. This would have changed big pieces of legislation that govern sanctions law, including the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And to institute legal reform on such a big act, it is a huge deal. Unfortunately, the invasion made people skittish and the bill was never introduced. And so it's basically hanging there. I believe that may change. We may get another chance at that. And I'll speak about that in a second. This work was largely done through a network called the Lift Sanctions Save Lives Network. I actually convened that group up until a few weeks ago. It started in 2018. It's a broad group of CSOs working in sanctioned countries, in or on sanctioned countries like Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria. Oh, I'm way over time. Okay, so I'm going to have to go quickly here. So, the success here was because of the fact that we had a global view. And basically, when you look at contexts specifically, I think it becomes easy to be politicized. If you just talk about North Korea, I think it's easy to attack. So I'm going to move really quickly here. Apologies, I only have 3 minutes. So there is a broad consensus that is developing that sanctions aren't working. We worked with a lot of groups across the political spectrum that have shown that. Office holders are not reflecting that. And again, I think it's because of fear speaking out. In my opinion, I think that there will be another opportunity to introduce reform efforts when the initial shock of the Russian invasion wears off. This winter will be very telling, especially with the energy markets in Europe and the global supply chains. Okay, climate change in 2 minutes. Here we go. Okay, I think it's often seen as a threat multiplier. The case is very clearly becoming apparent that it is the primary threat or will become the primary threat. I believe international relations will be reduced to the lowest common denominator: food, water, medicines, energy. We're already seeing this, right? US-North Korea relations are not immune. We've already seen this summer flooding at Yongbyon nuclear complex. We've seen the shared watersheds between the South and North Korean borders. North Korean control floodgates, and they do not communicate to South Korea when they open those floodgates. People have died as a result. We're going to see negative impact on yields, agricultural yields. We're going to see increased rates and pace of natural disasters, which we are already seeing. Compounding disasters could bring prolonged periods of emergency, and I think COVID is a perfect example of that, right? All of these things are going to compound and perhaps supersede the nuclear crisis. Yeah. Okay. Okay, quickly, just to wrap up here. So this is some data that was brought in from Project Drawdown. They basically created a human well-being index. They looked at the world over basically, and I think it shows basically the vulnerability of this region, right? North Korea is the lowest on this human well-being index, and I think that when you're talking about a country with nuclear weapons, it's clearly a threat to the regional security. So fortunately, the Project Drawdown has also identified about 28 solutions that are at the nexus of climate change and poverty alleviation. And I think while this is geared towards sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, it's also applicable to North Korea. And you can look, so if you talk about improving agriculture and agroforestry, not only can you reduce this amount of emissions, but you also have all these co-benefits: food, income, work, water and sanitation, health, gender equity, education, energy networks, and housing. And I think that this really just shows that this is what security is. When we're talking about building regional security, it's about investing in these types of outcomes. But current US policy is basically undermining all of this. I had more, but I think I'm a little short on time, so. Never again doing a PowerPoint. Okay, well, I can go into the last slide. The last slide here is, okay, it's about a Marine Corps University study that I think is really important. It came out in April, and, it basically showed that, that climate change is the #1 threat to humanity and national security. And it basically said that every tank movement is aiding the invisible enemy of climate change. And what they basically came to the conclusion of is that there's no denying that the US military strategy of maintaining global hegemony is now self-defeating, because we are now aiding the invisible enemy. I think this is an incredibly important study. I really encourage you all to look at it. Man, sorry for the technical difficulties here, folks. Okay. Okay. Well, the conclusion here really is that really this could mean that the US is forced to reckon with their strategy, right? Okay, I mean, maybe you can just turn it off at this point and just giving them a platform, I think. Okay, sorry for the choppy ending there, but I'm going to have to stop my comments because I'm way over time. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I apologize for this inconvenience that you had experienced. And I'm also apologizing to all of the audience here and also those who are watching this conference through Zoom. Probably this is happening because of somebody using whiteboard to interfere our discussion. And it is not a high-tech hacking, but there is some person who really wanted to interfere. And because of our student staff following things a little bit late, you may see some kind of a part of the annoying writings, and I hope everybody is feeling okay. So without any further interruption, I will invite Professor Jae Song to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Probably not. I'll just look at the screen. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. We can take it. Yeah. Okay. Aloha, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this very important conference today, Harrison and Taeung, and everyone who's helping the conference today at the university campus. So my name is Jae Song, and Song Ji-young in Korean. I'm holding a South Korean passport, but living in the land of Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation in today's Melbourne, Australia. So it was very interesting and inspiring to talk to the morning sessions, the presenters about the Hawaiian activism here, and also women's activism and the youth activism organized by Korean diaspora community. So I was very touched by the morning session. I'm not sure whether I can live up to the expectation for this afternoon with the possible hackers who try to intervene in our meaningful conference today. So today I'm going to talk about, the title of my presentation is Right to Survival Between Human Rights and humanitarianism. So the reason I see my job in today's conference is to offer an alternative voice from down under, or from where I'm from, or what I am as an ethnic Korean. So what I'm going to do is to present some unheard of or less heard of stories of North Korean perspective on this concept of human rights and humanitarianism. So, this is my first book based on my PhD thesis, Human Rights Discourse in North Korea, and I try to see in their public documents and discourse, basically from Nodong Shinmun, which is their daily newspaper, and the works of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. So that was my PhD. I tremendously enjoyed my PhD time back in the UK. So from North Korean documents, I can extract some of those basic ideas about human rights, which are vastly different from our understanding. Our means outside North Korea, including South Korean, US, and other Western perspectives on human rights. They first start with the post-colonial or anti-imperialist ideas of human rights, so which means abolishing those imperialist or colonialist is the realization of human rights in North Korea. So that's the first set of ideas they developed in their public documents on North Korea. And the second pillar is this Marxist or the communist socialist approach to human rights, which is again different from Western liberal democratic ideas of individual human rights. So they focus more on socio-economic rights over civil and political rights, and they focus on group rights or collective rights. For example, women's rights, children's rights, and these days they focus a lot on peoples with disabilities rights. So, which is different from individual right to life, individual right not to be tortured. So they have a slightly different set of ideas about human rights. And the third pillar of their human rights understanding in the DPRK public discourse is this Confucian ideas, or rather Neo-Confucian ideas about the rights are not something that you're born with or entitled to, but rights are only bestowed by a benevolent and virtuous leader who used to be Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, now Kim Jong-un. So based on this understanding, their survival pyramid is composed of this way. So the individuals hold rights, but that kind of bottom consensus doesn't exist in North Korean public discourse. So they start with the collectives, which is a collective of individuals. So without the collective entity, the individual rights and freedom is meaningless. You only exist in the collective in the nation state. You don't exist alone as an individual. But then in the above collectives, you have this right of nation state, which is sovereignty, sovereign right to develop nuclear weapons, for example. And above that, there is the regime survival. I think that's where we draw the line between international human rights and international law. And when it becomes the rights of a regime survival, or even the survival of the Kim family. Can you manually move to the next slide? It doesn't work, the flicker. Okay, so the right to survival in this multi-level and multi-dimensional analysis is those individual rights, the right to life and not to be tortured. That's mostly prescribed in the international law. It's called International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and also the right to subsistence. Ran out of battery or something. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And right to food, right to health, right to housing and education, that's again under international human rights law called International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. And then you have these collective rights, second generation of human rights of women, children, people with disability, And also you have right of ethnic and sexual minority, which North Korea doesn't actually recognize or ratify under international law. And then you have a third generation of human rights, which is a right to cultural heritage or right to clean environment. Then another level of right to survival at the state and regime level, or even Kim family survival rights, level is it's considered as a sovereign right to develop nuclear weapons, and it's also right to survival is realized through political purges. So whenever there is new leadership there, you see the evidence of political purges. They're killing and execution and sending them exile in remote areas in North Korea. And you see the rise and fall of Chang Song-taek. Chang Song-taek was the uncle of the current leader Kim Jong-un, but he was executed publicly, and it was broadcasted in North Korean state media. And you see Hyun Sung-wol, who's the leader of a propaganda division in the North Korean Workers' Party. And there was rumor that she was exiled, she was purged, but she was re-emerged as one of the powerful women and one of the powerful party members in North Korea. So it's interesting to see these key members, rise and fall in the North Korean political leadership and how they emerge and how they are, disappearing and withdrew from power. And what was interesting to listen to Christine's presentation this morning, the Women's Alliance and Solidarity, you obviously have to approach these powerful women in North Korea. So you see this, Hyun Sung-wol, Choi Sun-hee, and also, the wife of Kim Jong-un, and Kim Yo-jong, especially the sister of Kim Jong-un. And they're obviously not peace-loving women. So women being in this activism doesn't mean that all women have these peaceful ideas of collaboration and working for peace and security in the region. So obviously you need to think about engaging with these women in leadership in North Korea. And the assassination of Kim Jong-nam and the rise of Kim Yo-jong is in relation to this right to survival in a sort of family survival stage in North Korea. So in relation to right to survival, the family survival in Kim, you see, these two funerals, one in North Korea and the other, the recent funeral in the UK. You see sort of similar visual images. And the next one, you see two royal families. So one, the funeral of Kim Jong-il, and the other is the funeral of the Queen Elizabeth, late Queen Elizabeth. So this is just to show the mourning nation in North Korea and the UK, and how is sort of North Korean Kim family wanted to resemble this royal family in the UK and Europe in general. So they see themselves as a royal family, and this right to survival can be an extension of the right of the royal family, the Kim family. And this is the regime that we are talking about when we have to engage with the North Korean regime, people, and the nation state. So going back to the right to survival, and when Pyongyang cooperates on right to survival with the UN, is these yellow highlights. So they don't engage with the civil and political rights arena. They only engage with this EACR, economic, social, and cultural rights relevant conventions and committee. They do submit the periodic report to the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee. So they do show commitment to work with the international community when it comes to right to food, housing, health, and education, and increasingly more on the clean environment and working on climate change and poverty reduction. So that sort of area is where and when Pyongyang show their commitment to engage with the international community. And of course, women's rights, children's rights, and disability rights are the way they actually show the responses to outside world. So these are some of the positive signs that Pyongyang presented to us outside community. So they have ratified the ICCR, ICSR, and Children's Convention and the Women's Convention and the Disability Convention. So there are some of these positive signs where Pyongyang show their engagement and interaction with international community. And they also recently signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was in 1994. And the Kyoto Protocol is about in a clean environment, and the Paris Agreements recently in 2016. So I just highlighted in a red line here. This is the latest report they submitted to UPR, the UN Universal Periodic Review. They notified, they recently enacted the law on teachers and law implementation of curricula. They emphasize on people to enjoy their right to education and the disaster prevention, relief and recovery, and the control of mineral water and environmental protection and prevention of epidemics. And the last one on the socialist labor law, they stressed on the purpose of extending the period of maternity leave from 180 days to 240 days. I mean, in paper, I'm not sure whether that's actually practiced or implemented in real life, but at least they're showing this legal reform and the commitment to do it at least on paper. They're also not just the legal reform, but they're showing they're doing institutional measures to follow up and implement those legal reform. So number 14 says that it set up a national committee for the implementation of the international human rights treaties, which probably nobody is paying attention to. So all those institutional reform and legal reform has been largely ignored by international community. But those people who are in this room who would like to engage and continuously showing our commitment to negotiate, inviting them to the international fora, need to understand these are the areas where DPRK is willing to talk to us outside the Korean Peninsula. National Committee of Protection of Persons with Disability, these are the latest development where North Korea showed great interest and show their willingness to come out and talk about institutional building, capacity building, and follow up with legal reform. And number 15, Institute of Human Rights. This was actually, when I was doing my PhD more than 10 years ago, this institution already existed. But they said they reorganized this Institute of Human Rights in 2016 under the Academy of Social Sciences. So they're also showing some commitment to conduct some academic research or philosophical exploration about the concept of human rights, to engage with human rights experts. Number 16, department responsible for baby homes, children's homes, boarding schools. So these are the area, public health. So Key might be interested in, this DPRK's interest in children's and health issues. So the following paragraphs are also in relation to the right to health. So these are some of the examples I like to show you is where if we want to engage with the North Korean regime, we have to start with health, children, women, people with disability, is where the engagement is possible. So where DPRK cooperates on human rights is also where human rights meet humanitarianism. So I made women in bracket. They used to show a lot of interest in working with women's rights activists outside the Korean Peninsula, including those in the US. But these days, I think maybe because of the rise of Choi Sun-hee, Hyun Sung-wal, and Kim Yo-jong, the women's voices within the North Korean political leadership is getting very harsh, even harsher than their male fellow leaders at the party. So I don't see many sort of women's organization in the DPRK in North Korea is coming out and showing some peaceful narrative to outside world. But what they really focus on is looking after children, people with disability, focusing on health education and environment is where their current interests are. So they've been working with UNICEF, Food and Agriculture Organization, World Food Program, and UNDP, and other NGOs, especially in the sectors of healthcare, childcare, education, health, disability, environment sectors. For Pyongyang, for both human rights and humanitarian aid, means of survival for its people is good sign to encourage and keep engaging. For regime survival or even Kim family survival, maybe having nuclear weapon is their means to survive. For survival of the Kim family especially, and Kim and his supporter in Pyongyang basically, they need to prove both to convince the domestic and international audiences right to survival at all level has to be convinced by both domestic and international audiences to survive their regime and in particular the Kim family and their supporters. These are some of the pictures of the presence of UNICEF and World Food Program. And this top photo is the North Korean farmers are invited to a Canadian town to learn about the crop yield technicality. So there are some Canadian NGOs inviting North Korean farmers to their country to work on the agricultural cooperation, which is quite encouraging. So these can be some of, and there is a familiar face. He's falling asleep. That's right. I showed it. This is you. Okay. So there is some sector, health sector. Sorry, my voice is a bit sleepy. So what do we do as a concerned international community? So we heard about opposing militarism and imperialism. So oppose another Korean war, but working on conflict resolution, not conflict escalation. But at the same time, what Jenny does in 38 North is we also need to verify North Korea's weapons capability, which has to happen concurrently while opposing another Korean war conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We need to understand what kind of capabilities they have in North Korea. Number two, so these are some possible proposals for moving forward if we want to engage with North Korea. So one is oppose another Korean war. Second, sanction the regime, but not the people. So we need to look at the details of the sanction items, whether it's really hurting the people or hurting the regime. So we need to come up with a working and effective ways of imposing sanctions targeting the regime and the Kim family especially. Number three, strategic engagement, not strategic patience. I think a couple of panelists mentioned already the past 30 years US policy toward North Korea didn't stop North Korea going nuclear. It's even now South Korea is talking about they want to go nuclear, so the entire Korean Peninsula possibly going nuclear, which is not what we want. So strategic patience, I would say, with confidence, has failed. So we need a new approach. So I agree with the previous two panelists calling for a new approach to North Korea. So we need strategic engagement. So whenever we can, where we are, what we are, whether it's from focusing on economic, social, and cultural rights, or humanitarian aid to children, people with disability, and especially when it comes to climate change, climate action together with the youth movement, and also engaging with the women leadership in North Korea. I think this is possibly where we can move forward from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Namsan Song Namsan.
Thank you. I'm grateful for your invitation to Hawaii. My visit I checked it on my passport 9 years ago, so it is very fresh to me. Thank you. I appreciated the three very illuminating presentations. And I agree with Daniel, and that the U.S. sanctions are posing quite existential threat to North Korea. I visited Pyongyang 3 years ago in 2019 in March. On May Day, I visited Moranbong, and I saw people enjoying bulgogi. Well, the mountain was packed with people enjoying the parties. And I asked, how many do you think? My friends in North Korea said it will be as many as 70,000 on Moranbong today. But he added that it will not like me next year. It means North Koreans had been already prepared to hunger at that point of time. And that is happening now. So I saw many slogans in Pyongyang. One is 자력 견생. Yes, it is always there in 60s, 70s, 80s, all there. But I saw a new slogans saying 결임 불굴, endure and not surrender. Well, it is the same meaning that, okay, people, the time of hunger is coming, and it is now coming. I agreed with Jenny Town that the United States needs new approaches to the negotiation with North Korea. The US and North Korean negotiation has been fooled with initiative success and following failures. And since American conception of North Korea is based on some misleading conception. For instance, their nuclear development is only a reaction to US military initiatives. But for US, it is a provocation, right? And unless this gap gets filled, I don't think any new approach to the negotiation is feasible. And at the same time, the political leaders in both Koreas, as well as in Washington, seems to be losing the trusts in papers, ink and papers. They seem to have forgotten the documents, joint declarations and statements signed by them a couple of years ago. They totally forgotten it. And, losing the trust in ink and paper means the surrender of politics and diplomacy. That is happening now. So I think the trust in joint declaration, for example, the Singapore joint statement should be respected and valued again. And Pyongyang and Panmunjom joint declaration should be also valued again. Moon Jae-in administration towards its ends, they tried to restore the spirit of the declaration, but it was too late. And I think it should be resumed again. And let me, just my history. Well, I've been engaged in academic dialogues with North Korea over 30 years. And let me introduce some failures rather than success. In 2002, the ISKS, the organization, academic organization for Korean studies, attempted to hold a large conference for Korean studies in Pyongyang. No, I'm sorry, in Seoul. And we invited a group of North Korean academics to visit South Korea. And North Korean authorities were ready to send 70 academics to Seoul. But just 2 weeks before the conference, the second Yonpyeong battle broke, and the conference was canceled. And we tried next. Okay, let's hold it in Pyongyang. And we invited 200 South Korean scholars to Pyongyang. Okay, Pyongyans were ready to accept all of them. But 1 month ago, prior to the conference, you see, a South Korean group, small group, applied for the permission to visit Pyongyang on the 10th anniversary of President Kim Il-sung's passing away. And South Korean government said, no, you can't go. Then Pyongyang, as a counter measure, they denied all the South Korean participants entering Pyongyang. And my third attempt was made in 2021 to hold the conference in Pyongyang, but it was deterred by the COVID-19. Well, I'm introducing my failures because how important is a new framework, as Ki Park mentioned, where the civil or 1.5 track negotiation and dialogues and cooperation could be relatively safely guaranteed. We need mutually agreed framework to build the trust between the North and South, even between the North and America. It takes time, and we should be ready to take a long, winding road to build the trust in the new mutually agreed framework. That's my hope.
Thank you very much. As some of you may know, I had been working for the UN as a member, vice chair, and chair rapporteur of UN Human Rights Council Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. While I was working for that human rights mandate, I visited Ukraine when the country was on war, which started in 2013 and 14, and we visited the territory where rebel groups were controlling. We were moving in an armored truck, and we actually crossed the zone where artillery exchanges are going on. And we really worked to end that kind of human rights atrocity and humanitarian crisis. But after several years, we now see all over the world started there, and it is aggravated. The reason why we are discussing this topic today is because we cannot witness similar atrocities happening on Korean Peninsula and between those countries that has a stake on Korea. To some, our discussion could be viewed as a very too progressive. To some, it can be viewed not enough, but at least this candid discussion and exposure to complicated nature of the issue will be useful. That's my center's belief. So we are not agreeing on all of the presentations given or remarks made today, but we really treasure this discussion is one we really need, and we should find a way to maintain peace, and if possible, preserving and enhance it into permanent peace on Korean Peninsula and possibly unification in Korea. So we are running out of time, but without having a chance to ask questions to these wonderful speakers today, we cannot dismiss. So I will allow a couple of questions to our speakers. So if any of you have any questions, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and please speak. And I'm also again apologizing for the hacking attempt. The person is persistent, and even if I remove all of the names and also blocked the participants' activity, it's still coming up. So later on, if you see this annoying remarks, please don't be annoyed too much. We will definitely remove this when we upload this video later, so don't worry about it. So I have a person who have raised their hand. You first.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Wilson, and I was curious with the new and president in South Korea. Is there any sort of way you're going to have to realign to accommodate the less peace-focused administration? I'm sorry, that's the best way I can put it.
So the question seems to be whether there is a possibility for new government to realign the policy towards that direction. So we will take another question before answering. So there was one from Kristen.
I have two questions, if that's okay. The first is to Jenny. There was an article in NK News a few days ago that the Biden administration really wants to engage with North Korea. And I didn't seem to believe it, but I'm curious, just being in Washington, I guess this is more for you and Dan, if you think there is any movement. And then the other question is for Professor Song. Hatoyama just gave a speech in South Korea apologizing for Japan's imperialism and war crimes. I was just really curious about the timing of it, given the shift towards strengthening U.S., ROK, Japan alliance in the face of, the new Cold War. And then just lastly, I just really appreciated Professor Song's presentation. And I was just in Korea and Taiwan with Madoka Saji, who is with the Human Rights Council in Seoul. And she did note that in 2019, North Korea did respond to the periodic review, but that they also stopped for a workshop. And so I always think it's important to note that that followed the historic summits of 2018, and that peace and engagement actually is a really important foundation towards improving the human rights situation. Thank you.
So I will give microphone first to Jenny, and then Dr. Song, and then maybe Song Ji-young as well. Okay. And of course, Dan, if you want to add, you can.
Thank you. First, to Christine's question in terms of the Biden administration wanting to engage, the difference between Obama administration's strategic patience and the Biden administration's calibrated and practical approach has been that there's no preconditions to talks. The Biden administration from the beginning has wanted to get back to negotiations, but wanted to get back to denuclearization talks. But the problem is that there's no incentive for the North Koreans to re-engage on denuclearization at this point in time. The geopolitical realities have shifted so much since 2018, when we did have a real opportunity and the North Koreans were really willing to talk about their nuclear program. Part of that is, the real emphasis on great power competition, rising US-China competition. And this has really, fueled an arms race in the region. You have, the US, you have all the great powers, Russia, China, and the US, all working towards nuclear modernization and expansion. You have South Korea and Japan increasing defense budgets, developing new missiles, both offensive and defensive. You have, rising mini lateral security pacts in the region as, part of movements towards China as well. And so, first you have the question of why would North Korea come to the table to talk about unilateral limits on their own weapons development when the rest of the region is arming up, and that's not a very compelling argument to make. But two, you also don't have international consensus anymore on how to deal with North Korea. So in 2017, and prior to 2017, every time North Korea did, especially a longer range missile launch or a nuclear test, there was consensus at the UN Security Council and unanimous votes at the UN Security Council for new resolutions, new sanctions being imposed, and universal condemnation of North Korea's activities. You don't have that now. Now you have, especially on the North Korea issue, division along ideological lines, right? You have China, Russia not willing to put more sanctions on North Korea, even if they do condemn the actions, but are asking for a more constructive approach. With the rationale, of course, that, well, the sanctions didn't work. It didn't work in convincing North Korea, from dissuading North Korea from going down this road. Where, there's a point to that, right? Like, it hasn't dissuaded North Korea from this strategic path. And so the question then becomes, what are we willing to do? And if you look at what happened after the Hanoi summit, I think there's some really important lessons there. In the past, negotiations had been working level negotiations that would then eventually get escalated up and signed off by the presidents and the leaders in order to, once they've already worked out the details. So you had sort of a bottom-up process. In 2018, you had this summit-driven, leader-driven negotiation process, so a top-down process. And the problem is that, as much as the expectation was that if you're working leader to leader, you could do more, you could go faster, that there was, room for breakthrough because you weren't bogged down in the working level. You had kind of high-level mandates and high-level political attention. The results ended up being the same. They negotiated, they thought they were going to get agreement, they couldn't agree to terms, especially within the constraints of the summits themselves. And then, this was a big embarrassment for the North Koreans walking away from this. And one that cost, several of the negotiators their careers, and some of them we haven't seen since then, like, Ri Young-ho, who was foreign minister at the time. So to re-engage, when the North Koreans come back to the table, there is an expectation that they will get something, and get something within a short amount of time. And so, having these long, drawn-out negotiations that may or may not turn into an agreement, that may or may not be sustainable in implementation, is just not a very attractive proposition, and one that comes at a high cost of failure, of being wrong and advising Kim Jong-un to try again. So, yes, the Biden administration has been open to talks, has presented the option of talks, has invited the North Koreans to talks. It hasn't been a very specific invitation, and there hasn't been any specific, conveyance of anything that would build confidence that if they showed up, we could make progress, and progress quickly enough for it to be useful. On the Yoon administration, Yoon's policy has been, we've seen a couple iterations of it. He's, announced this audacious plan, which isn't very audacious because it's still contingent on North Korea committing to denuclearization up front. And then, of course, there's all the benefits that come with that. But that's what we always do. And then, there's also the 3D policy towards North Korea, which is deterrence, dissuasion, and diplomacy, which again is still a pretty traditional path on how we've dealt with North Korea. And the way they've explained it is, that they want to, build up deterrence, bolster deterrence, and increase the efforts towards dissuading North Korea in terms of, the use of sanctions and other things to try and dissuade North Korea from doing, further development and tests. In order to get to diplomacy with the understanding if you do enough deterrence and enough dissuasion that North Korea has no other choice. Well, that's been proven wrong over and over and over, but yet we keep reverting back to it. And so, like I said, I think we really need to be thinking about what would actually be an audacious plan. How can we actually be audacious in this? And again, what are we willing to do to make that an attractive proposition? And until we get to that mindset, we're just going to continue to barrel down this cycle that we've been on for 30 years.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. I don't want to stand long before the interesting documentary film screening. So the first question, thank you so much, Christine, for those two very interesting questions. So the first one, timing of the Hatoyama's apology, I think it was probably, this is just my informed guess, but I think that gesture was pushed by the US government. Because from US, South Korea, or Korea as a whole, US and Japan's improved relation is good for their Indo-Pacific strategy. So for Japan, it's always, they're pushed by the US to, offer an apology to Koreans, and Koreans accept that apology. This is serving the US interest. So I think this is not just the out of the blue kind of gesture. So this is coincide with a trilateral military exercise that's happening in the East Coast. Second, the DPRK submission of the UPR report to the UN. It's a bit ironic because the international community is asking the DPRK to come and incorporate with the international human rights community. But when they do submit the reports, nobody is paying attention. Or even if they do, they just don't believe it. That's just what they say on paper, but they don't actually implement or realize it. So what are you supposed to do if you're sitting in a DPRK, setting up an Institute for Human Rights? What am I supposed to do? Submit or not submit? Submit, then nobody's trusting me. Nobody is paying attention to my report. So you just have to understand from their perspective. I'm not their spokesperson or anything, and I don't have authority to speak on their behalf. But at one point, if those willing international members of the international community just try to see from their perspective what can they do. It could be just their own family survival, but survival of the nation state or survival of the entire nation. They're gonna do something, but whatever they do has not been working very well. So they probably push to one option, which is not desirable for everyone, including those living on the Korean Peninsula, to develop nuclear weapons and doing more missiles. And they just fired a missile over Japan this morning. So they're a bit pushed to the corner, and we have to be coming out with more strategic engagement, not patient. Patient is basically just wait until they die out, basically.
Thank you very much for the question. My answer will be quick. I personally still believe that the denuclearization of the peninsula can be feasible only through providing North Korea with a robust guarantee of its regime security. And one possible, option is restoration of six-party talks, because this kind of robust guarantee of the security should be made multilaterally. But at the moment, the restoration of six-party talks regime is getting harder and harder and unrealistic, because South Korea, on one hand, trying to get its ties with Japan and the United States getting consolidated. On the other hand, North Korea is trying to strengthen its tie with China and Russia. So there are rather strong two triangle bloc existing in East Asia. And I fear that even restoring the six-party talks framework, it may end up with just confrontation between the two parties and two blocs. That's the very, very risky and dangerous situation. So is there any alternative? Maybe one feasible one is UN Security Council members plus South Korea, or even plus Japan. That could be possible, because EU may play a role to make the United States commitments a little more consistent, as it has shown in Middle East and some other countries in the peace settlement. But I'm not sure about it. But anyway, at the moment, forming two blocks, surrounding Korean Peninsula is getting risky and risky, because it may end up with nuclear, new Cold War getting installed on DMZ.
Thank you very much, Dan. Because you have not spoken, can I ask you to kind of give a final remark in 1 minute?
Well, let me start by saying thank you to the staff for working through all those technical difficulties. That was quite amazing of you all. And I think I can just sort of buttress some of the comments that were made already. And I guess just to Jenny's point about Biden administration and is there any real sincere desire for engagement, I think that the Biden administration probably wants the lowest lift possible, and they probably want to look like they're engaging, but I don't know that even if they came to the table that they're willing to spend much political capital on engagement with North Korea. Unfortunately, I don't mean to be cynical, but I really do think that's probably where they're at. And I will point out that some of you will remember that Biden wrote an op-ed in Yonhap during the presidential elections promising to basically improve humanitarian aid delivery, as well as try to work towards reunions of Korean American families and their loved ones in the North. They've taken 0 steps to do any of that. And I think that if they were serious and they really wanted to engage, they would start to reconsider some of those basic policies and start to take some of that low-hanging fruit. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for helping me with my presentation as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for your patience for all these technical difficulties. And we are behind the schedule. But as you know, we will have a screening of the movie Crossings. So after 5 minutes of a very short break, we will begin that session. And that movie screening will be followed by a question and answer with the director as well as other involved persons. And more dialogue will be coming. Please stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Okay. So this movie premiered last November in Honolulu, and I remember sitting, and some moments are so poignant. The scene where you guys part with your North Korean counterparts. The scene where Gloria steps up and says, "You should be grateful to Christine." So many scenes make you so think about everything from your personal to the bigger levels. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much. Um, the floor is open. Floor is open. Yes.
Hi, my name is June. I had two separate questions. One of my questions was for Deann. Like, was there one moment scene, that was edited out of the final film that you really wanted to keep in? And for Christine and Anne, I'm wondering, are there any tactics or strategies that, in hindsight, you might have done differently for the crossings and going into North Korea? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Well, first, thanks everybody for being here, and thank you for Center for Korea Studies for inviting us and for screening the film. I'm sorry it was out of sync. I'm not sure quite what happened, but I apologize for that. In terms of the scenes, yeah, I mean, I think if I had my druthers, the film might be like 3 hours long, but you would all be like asleep by now. So one of the, I think if I could have, I would have included more of the North Korean women's testimonies in the film. And maybe at a certain point, I might actually try to have some additional clips of their testimonies. I think they were really powerful. I think for the purpose of the film, I had to, keep them very short. Yeah, I think that's one among many. In terms of the historical context, the sound is so strange. I don't know. There's feedback. Okay. It's very distracting, so I apologize. There's just so much contextual material, in the film, and in the editing process, I really came to think a lot about the audience and who the audience of the film is, and to really try to be very strategic about what historical context that I put in the film and how much history would be necessary for someone who might be new to this material to kind of comprehend and grasp enough of the content to really go on this journey with the women and follow what was happening. So, I think if I could have, I would have put more history in there. But again, there were sort of editorial decisions I had to make. And it's a film that's very much for an American audience. And I think, well, anyway, it's for an American audience who might know something about Korea, but not very much. And so it has that sort of, I guess, orientation. Yeah.
It's a great question, June. And I'm sitting here thinking, gosh, what would I've done differently? And I don't know, you might have some good insight, but I would say if we had had the resources, maybe we could have done more education of the delegation before we went. But I have to tell you, since God, like Deann doesn't even capture the whole behind the scenes of getting the approvals, and I had to travel to Pyongyang 3 times that spring. As you saw, my daughter, when I crossed, she was barely 3, I think. So it was insane. And it's hard to think back. And when I keep watching the film, which now I've done quite a bit, it's still incredible to me that at that time, when it was under Park Geun-hye, and you think about the Candlelight Revolution and what subsequently happened that led to her overthrow, it's really remarkable that we even crossed the DMZ.
Well, when Christine called me and said, "Hey, would you like to go to North Korea?" I'm a retired Army colonel. I've been in the State Department 16 years, and it was like, "Are you kidding? You know, that's not something I want to do." But she kept saying, "Well, it's going to be very interesting." Yeah, I know it will be, all of this sort of stuff, but you know, it's kind of dangerous. And she said, "Oh no, I've taken my daughter there 3 times, and all's been well." But on the thing of what you know, the challenges that we had and the delegation that you put together. I mean, 2 Nobel Peace Laureates, activists from all over the world, and there really was a split in what kind of activism people wanted to do. And as you saw in the film, Maureen Maguire, Nobel Peace Laureate from Northern Ireland, she was, you know, to hell with all of these rules. We're going to cross the DMZ. We're going to walk right across it, and who cares what happens and all that. And there was a good group contingent on that. And then I was kind of on the other side. Well, I've been in the military, and I've been a diplomat, and I know we're going to get in big trouble with that. And so the dilemma, which was captured, was really one of the critical parts of that whole thing. But what I have a question on, you all have just come back from South Korea, and how did the South Korean women that we worked with and the incredible stresses and strains that they were under, how was the film received there?
Deann, you should. Yes, so Christine and I have just been in Korea. We screened the film in Seoul to a full theater of a couple hundred people, and it's also showed at the DMZ Peace Arts Festival in Paju, where we actually came out in 2015 at Imjinggak Park. And then it showed as part of the DMZ Border Peace School, about 50, 60 activists and Korean diasporic people from different parts of the world. And it was really interesting. It was very well received. We were nervous because because it does have a lot of historical context that maybe Koreans who grew up in Korea may be more familiar with than American audiences. And also, we weren't sure how, with the Yoon government, how it would be received. But we didn't get deported. We didn't get arrested. I was surprised. I think we had some really interesting conversations with people, and there's a lot of interest to screen the film in Korea among various organizations and nonprofit organizations. I think people are really excited to continue to screen and have conversations in Korea.
Yeah, one of the comments we often get when we were in Korea was, "Why didn't the film come out sooner? You would have gotten like a really warm reception from the Moon administration." I was like, "I know, Deann, we might get deported under the Yoon administration." Because you know that many of you may know this, but in 2016, oh yeah, Anne remembers this, but I was meeting Anne in Shanghai. I was leaving actually from San Francisco to take a plane to Shanghai. It stopped in Incheon, and I was banned from entering South Korea because of this peace walk. Park Geun-hye put me on that blacklist. So luckily, Moon Jae-in had just come into power, and so quickly they let me into the country. So anyway, back to this thing about like, oh, why didn't it get done, Deann, sooner? But it actually feels like it's out at the right time. It actually is like really galvanizing the the South Korean peace movement. It really felt like it gave a jolt of energy to them. And so that's, it felt like, and so far, like all the South Korean women's peace groups that are our partners are getting organized to do national screenings. This is so weird to do this.
Joel, did you have a question?
Hello? Hello, my name is Joao, and I'm from California. I actually had two questions I wanted to ask. The first one that I have is for the whole panel. Why do you personally think that the US media, and to another extent, the South Korean media, is sharpening the notion that you are, or at least at the time were, North Korean apologists?
It's just what the media does. And whether it's the U.S., when you go to Cuba, when you go to Iran, when you go to Russia, when you go China, and North Korea, of course, has always been on the target list forever. So anybody that goes to any of the countries that the U.S. Has foreign policy difficulties with, our very compliant media goes after you big time. And then when you go to a place, the South Korean government, as the national security law was so well discussed in the movie, is horrible. And so the media follows what the government wants, and man, they go after you big time. They really do. While I've got the microphone, I'll just make one other comment. One of the most important parts of the trip to me was, actually getting to talk to North Korean women. And it was through translators that were provided by the government. But the longer we were with those women in the buses, in the meetings, the more that you could talk just as human beings, then you felt at a comfortable level that they were actually translating pretty accurately what you were discussing with other people. And it turned out we met with some of those women 6 months later. Because one part we didn't go into too much in this film is that we've tried to continue a relationship with North Korean women. And 6 months after we were there in May in North Korea, we met with, 7 North Korean women who flew to Indonesia, because Indonesia is one of the places North Koreans do not have to have visas. And so Christine had arranged for us to have a joint or a trilateral meeting, international women, North Korean women, South Korean women, all together in Bali, and tell them what happened.
North Korea tested, it's like your story, Professor Song. North Korea tested a hydrogen bomb, and South Korea said, you can't go to meet the North Korean women or else you'll get fined or imprisoned, and so the South Korean women didn't come, but the North Koreans came. So that was,
the North Korean women came, and 4 of the women were the translators from before, plus the North Korean ambassador to Mexico, and she was one of the key people in Pyongyang too. So that group of women were there, and we knew them. So here we were meeting with them a second time in Indonesia. It was the first time that 3 of them had ever been out of North Korea. So being with them as they saw, and this was in Bali, not a bad place to go for a meeting, but to be with them as they saw the outside world, so to speak, for the very first time, and to hear the comments from them. Then after the North Korean women left, 2 hours later, the South Korean women flew into Bali, and then we had a meeting with the South Korean women, telling them what the North Korean women had said. And in fact, all the notes that were left for them and the materials that had been prepared during that first week. But the whole issue of continuing meeting with North Korean women, which you all did in Beijing too, a little later.
Yeah. To your question, Joelle, I think that Anne just, hit the nail on the head. But There's a famous quote from this guy, I think his name is Donald McIntyre. He was the Seoul bureau chief of Time magazine. And he says, like North Korea sells. It sells, when North Korea conducts a missile test, when something like North Korea, that's what sells. And I think what's so extraordinary about this film and the feedback I've heard people who have gone to North Korea many times, that have lived in North Korea as foreigners doing humanitarian aid work, or have long been involved in peace and reunification efforts, have told Deann, this is one of the best films ever made that most accurately portrays the situation in North Korea. So I think that this is a counter to that just continues to vilify, demonize North Korea, that enables us to perpetuate the longest US war against North Korea.
I'm going to hire Christine as my publicist, the film's publicist. I think you raise a really good question, and it's part of a larger systemic, issue around how the Korean War is remembered and narrated, and sort of the collective national narrative around the war. And it has to do with how I think memory works, and how memory and forgetting have been mobilized as kind of a strategic resource in this contest for power. And I feel like, they often say wars are fought twice, first on the battlefield and then in memory. And I think with regard to the Korean War and how it's constantly referred to as the forgotten war, it's part of the whole way in which corporate journalism portrays the war, that it's forgotten, it's forgotten. And whenever people try to promote engagement, people are, dismissed or, considered apologists or what have you. I think also there's a tendency in the US for us as Americans to see ourselves as ethically superior and free of ideology, whereas we see the North Koreans as just automatons, brainwashed, and only capable of ideology. Americans don't commit propaganda. North Koreans only commit propaganda. And so, when we try to engage with a country that's portrayed in that way, we're automatically considered to be, dupes of this propaganda machine. So I think it's complicated. I've really thought, I continue to think a lot about how memory and forgetting works in terms of how this war continues to be fought. It's not just, war drills and sanctions and all of that. I mean, all of that, of course, is taking place, but it's also this continued narrative about the war. I think it's interesting that Monica Kim, who just won the MacArthur Award, one of the key things she says in her video presentation is that we have to pay attention to the way in which warfare is narrated. That's an important thing, and I think if we can think more about how we ourselves think about this war and talk about this war as activists, as scholars, as journalists, I think there's very knee-jerk kinds of things that we say, that people say about North Korea. I think that really needs to be challenged. And this constant obfuscation about who is responsible for the war, what happened in the war. There's so much obfuscation on so many different levels. If we can try to really penetrate some of that and do some deep work, and when we speak about North Korea and this war, to really think about what we're saying and how that impacts this kind of narrative accretion, this narrative accretion. I don't know how to express that, but I do think that if we can change the story, that's an important component of perhaps changing how this war unfolds.
Thank you. Just picking up your last point, Deann. First of all, kudos for making this wonderful film. I just learned so much. And you sort of clarified that this was targeted to the American audience. And I actually want to see the entire documentary, the film clips. If it's 3 hours, 5 hours, I don't care. I just watch the entire clip.
And I have hours and hours. We can sit together in an edit room if you'd like.
So I'm just wondering, is from that sort of technical editorial perspective, if you can edit it differently, do you think you can make a sort of second film targeting South Korean audience or even outside the American? I can sort of pick up how those South Korean and even North Koreans are portrayed in the documentary. They're very short clips of representing their identity, their values. And also, I think it was Disney who said, everything she saw in Pyongyang was against her values. And that's liberalism, that's feminism, or some can call it feminist nationalism or patriotism in the very US-centric, American-centric way. So I was just wondering whether you have an idea or had an idea of making a second film targeting Korean or Asian audience. Actually, I have one question each. Christina, I think everyone is wondering if there is going to be any DMZ Crossing 2. Is there any planning ahead? I mean, you ended the film, Let's Get Started. So is there any progress? It's been 7 years already. Last question. And picking up that point on, I think there was those South Korean women activists were saying, these white feminists coming to the Korean Peninsula, and I think was also a North Korean saying something about their propaganda, their brainwash idea about the American imperialism, and then now looking at this white, whatever other colored women activism crossing the border. How do you reconcile that sort of criticism, internal criticism from South Korean women's activists?
Great questions. Thank you. In terms of editing a second version, I don't think I'm going to, but I mean, if I had the resources, maybe. But I do think that the editing was quite complicated. And if you really look at the film carefully and do a rhetorical analysis, it's very subtle. And it's very within the current ideological framework of the US at this moment. I think if it was a different time, if, let's say, the war was no longer and there was a peace agreement and relationships were different, I think the film would have been quite different. The question of whether I would do a version for North Korean audiences, I think that's really complicated. It's really, when we started on the journey, the film, as a filmmaker, my intention was to follow the women to see whether they could actually cross the DMZ or not. And so that was sort of the narrative arc. What were the challenges, the political obstacles, the social obstacles, the logistical obstacles? And that was the key narrative arc. But what really happened along the way were these kind of questions, these ethical questions, questions that Abby Disney and Medea and others who raise about their presence in North Korea, and they're struggling with being there. And I think the key question for me as a filmmaker was whether the women could actually see humanity in the North Korean people, and whether they could kind of deal with their preconceptions and how they would deal with their preconceptions. It's so hard to sort of mobilize empathy for North Korean people. And I just, that became a key question for me. And I think in the end, I think all of the women came away with different understandings and different, perspectives. But I think they all did recognize that there were human beings there, and to the degree that they could. That seems like a small thing, really, to be able to just recognize that there's people there. But with North Korea, it's really hard to come to that. And I felt like in the end that they, in their own way, did come to that. And at the same time, also recognize that this conflict needs to end. And they each committed in their own way to actually continue to work for
for peace. So I think that those were sort of the key kind of narrative, moments in the film. I think also that I mean, in part to the question about kind of feminism and the South Korean women's concerns about kind of high-profile white women coming into Korea. I really see this film as kind of a case study of a group of very diverse women with diverse understandings of Korean War history, of the Korean War situation, the political dynamics, and trying to work through their differences, and also dealing with questions about, kind of white feminist imperialism and how do they work through these differences of race, language, culture, et cetera. And as you see in the film, it was a complicated process. It's not a perfect process. And I think that there was a lot of discussions and honest conversations going on. And in the end, they, came to a consensus about specific actions. So I sort of see it as sort of a case study of that kind of collective work.
So in 2019, I traveled to Cambodia to meet Mr. O, who was kind of the lead helping to organize the 2015 activities. He's with the National Peace Committee. And that's because there's a travel ban on Americans going to North Korea, unless you can get a special validation passport for humanitarian journalism or national interest. And I didn't qualify for national interest. So they wanted to do another DMZ crossing meeting, something. And so I brought a suite of options. We could do this, we could do this. And they were very excited about doing some kind of international gathering in 2020 for the 70th anniversary of the war. And we had actually then taken the proposal to South Korea, to the Blue House, and they were very receptive. But then COVID happened. And so we even lined up some members of Congress, some congressional women to also say they would go. And then Corona happened. So things are so much more complicated now because of the Trump travel ban that's still in place. So I don't know what we're going to do. But we have to do something because next year is such a significant year. And I would say that, we really, as we saw with the 2018 summits, the U.S. is a key obstacle towards progress on peace on the Korean Peninsula. So we have really, especially Women Cross DMZs, put a lot of our energy in trying to change the political narrative and will in the United States. So in some ways, that's our DMZ crossing. And do you want to say?
Yeah. Well, and I guess when, not if, but when there is another trip, I mean, you'd probably need to organize for like 500 people to go, because the numbers of people who've come up to all of us to say, I want to go on that next trip. I want to go to North Korea. I want to meet North Koreans. I want to talk to them. I want to see the country. I want to let North Koreans know that we as Americans or whatever nationality, that we don't hate them, and we want their country to flourish. So there'll be, hundreds of people want to go, and this film just kind of piques one's interest a little bit more in it. So if we can ever get the travel ban lifted, if we can ever get the North Koreans feeling like health-wise that they can allow internationals to come into the country, then things will start perking. And one of the things that we found out when we were there was that there's quite an international movement of travel from China, of internationals from China that are in China that travel into Pyongyang, and they are on what's called sometimes the beer tour. Because each one of the big international hotels in Pyongyang have a micro brewery down in the basement, and so there's good beer there. So there are travel groups that have been bringing people from Beijing up by train, or I guess Americans had to fly. But there was a bit of a tourist industry anyway that was going, and I'm ready to go.
All right. Oh, what? Two more questions. Two more questions, Key, and then.
Great. Thank you.
Yes. Gentleman over there.
Yeah.
Key. Yeah.
So this is my second time seeing this, and I was just as riveted as my first time. First of all, I don't know, you look just like Jeju when you was your age. I don't know. And then another tidbit is that there's a whole segment about the 1980s, late 80s, sort of demonstrations in South Korea. And Professor Beck, who's sitting right in front of me, was right at the forefront of the movement. You got to recognize that. Yeah. But that, for me, the most poignant scene was inside the People's Cultural Hall when women were sharing their testimonies. I've been there many times, over 10 times, sitting in those exact seats. And to hear these personal testimonies is so powerful. It's the most powerful tool that I've seen to humanize North Korean people. So the question I have is, what can we do as individuals, institutions, organizations to use this tool to further this, the activities that you want to, how do we get the message out further? What can we do to help?
Well, we are in the midst of an impact campaign with this film, and we're trying to bring the film to hundreds of community organizations throughout the U.S. and the world. So if anybody wants to screen the film, let us know. And I think it's a great tool to spark discussions about a variety of different issues. So feel free to contact us, and you can contact me through Harrison. I think it's also important to tell our stories, whether we're Korean diasporic people, whether we have families who might have had their fathers fight in the Korean War as veterans. One of the things I realized about this film is that it is bringing up a lot of stories of people who come up to us and say, I'm from a divided family. My parents were originally from the North, but I never talk about it. Or my father fought in the Korean War and he never talks about it. Or there was specific traumas around the war that, as a younger person, that they experience this intergenerational trauma. So I think that those experiences are really important. The more we can share our stories, and the more we're willing to put them out into the public, I do think that there is a way in which all of our stories contribute to increased public awareness and building kind of this political knowledge and education for working toward peace in Korea.
Yes. Final question.
안녕하십니까. My name is Bokdong Yoon Bokdong. I was born in 52 in Busan. I was wondering if you'd ever visited any orphanages in the north and south too. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. You were born in Busan, you said? Okay. Yes. I have visited an orphanage in North Korea and also a number of orphanages in South Korea, including in Busan, actually. In Busan, I visited 3 orphanages that were for mixed race orphans whose mothers were Korean and their fathers were American servicemen. And very interesting, there's still records available actually at these orphanages and also in Seoul and along the DMZ. Part of the fascination for me is that I'm an adopted person as well. And so I have been separated from my original family in Korea through international adoption and feel very much this connection with divided families in Korea who are divided because of the ongoing war. And maybe that's part of my motivation for making all these films about Korea and the Korean War. But one of the projects I'm working on is about mixed race Korean adoptees whose origins are in Busan and also along the DMZ border in the military camp towns. And when we were in Paju this past week, in addition to doing a pilgrimage along the
border villages along the DMZ, I also met with a journalist who's been helping to document the experiences of mixed race adoptees. So this interconnection between the ongoing war and the US military presence in Korea and transnational adoption is very integrated and something that I'm very interested in. But if you'd like information about the orphanages in Busan, I'd be happy to share with you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you again for coming for this event and wonderful talk. And thank you again for your participation at this conference. As you know, this center just celebrated 50th anniversary in September. And the first director of this center, I'm seventh director, first director, Professor So Dae-soo had passed away last month. He had visited North Korea more than 20 times. And he was one who wrote about the origin of Kim Il-sung in North Korea. And he had worked very hard to promote dialogue and unification on Korean Peninsula. Time is different now, but my center is really interested in promoting continuously this peace dialogue. And also, hopefully, when time is right, we would like to invite some North Korean scholars to this Center for Korean Studies so that we can continue dialogue in many fronts. We really admire what you have done, and I really think women are better than men, I think, in this difficult time. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.